The morning of the cruise. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for almost 20 minutes, deciding whether the floral maxi dress made me look like I was trying too hard for a woman of 66. I decided it didn't. I decided I had earned the right to try hard for something after all these years of trying hard for other people instead. Sunscreen on my shoulders. My straw tote by the door packed the night before with a paperback I never got to read, and a bag of butterscotch candies Winnie liked to steal out of my purse when she thought I wasn't looking. I remember the light coming through the kitchen window that morning, gold and thick, the kind of light that makes you believe a day is going to be good to you. I had been sewing since I was 14 years old. My mother taught me on a Singer machine that groaned every time you pushed the pedal too hard, and by the time I was 30, I had my own little shop 2 blocks off Main Street, Ostrander's Alterations hand-lettered sign bell over the door. I built that business alone mostly. Walter helped where he could in the early years, fixing the wiring, building the counter with his own 2 hands out of a slab of walnut he'd been saving for something else. But the sewing itself was mine, every stitch of it. And I was proud of that, in a quiet way I never talked about, because talking about it felt like bragging, and I was not raised to brag. My mother had learned from her own mother, a woman I never met, who according to family stories mended uniforms during a war for a wage that barely covered the thread. And who taught her daughters that a needle in a woman's hand was a kind of insurance policy nobody could take away from her. Not a husband, not a bank, not bad luck. My mother passed that same lesson to me the way you pass down anything precious and slightly dangerous, carefully, a little at a time, making sure I understood both what it could give me and what it might cost. She used to say a woman who could sew would never go hungry and would never be fully at the mercy of anyone else's decisions about her. And I believed her the way you believe things you're told young enough all the way down into your bones, long before you have any proof of your own. I think of her often now, more than I did when I was younger, and certain I already understood everything she'd tried to teach me. It took losing a husband and nearly losing a son to finally understand what she meant by insurance. Walter died when Dwight was 6 years old. A heart that gave out on a Tuesday afternoon while he was mowing the lawn. No warning, no slow decline to prepare for just the mower running in place against the fence line until a neighbor noticed and came to see why. I was inside hemming a wedding dress for a bride I never did finish the alterations for, because by the time I got outside, nothing in my life was the same shape it had been 10 minutes earlier. After that, it was just the 2 of us, me and my son, and a sewing machine that never stopped humming because it had to feed us both. 34 years now since that Tuesday. 34 years of never stopping. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters later what 34 years of never stopping looks like when it finally stops being seen by the people you did it for. By the time Dwight was grown and gone from the house, the shop had become something closer to a second home than a place of business. I knew my regulars by the particular trouble they brought me. Each season a young mother who brought in her husband's dress shirts because he'd started putting on weight and was too proud to buy a new size, a retired postal worker who liked to sit in the chair by the window and talk about his grandchildren while I pinned his trousers, careful never to prick him even once in 40 years of trying. I liked the rhythm of it. The bell over the door. The particular smell of steam and starch that never fully left my hands, no matter how many times I washed them. The small satisfaction of handing someone back a garment that finally fit them properly, as if fitting properly were a thing a person could simply be given if someone else took the trouble to measure them right the first time. I had built something steady out of nothing but a rented storefront and my mother's old machine, and some mornings walking to open up before the rest of the street had even woken. I still felt a small private pride in that, the kind I never once said out loud to anyone, not even to Dwight, because I had been raised to believe a woman who spoke her own pride out loud was inviting trouble to come sit down across from her uninvited. I raised Dwight mostly alone in the years after Walter died, though I never once let myself think of it as alone while I was living it. There was always a customer needing a favor turned around by Friday, a school recital to sit through with a program clutched in my lap, a fever to sit up with until 3 in the morning with a cool cloth and a paperback I never got past the first chapter of. I packed his lunches. I coached him through long division at Walter's old desk, the same desk where I would one day sit reading a deed with different eyes entirely. I never remarried, not because no one asked, because 2 men did over the years, and I said no to both of them gently, but because some part of me had decided without ever quite deciding it out loud that my whole self already belonged to a shop and a son, and there wasn't room left over to offer anyone else something less than whole. I remember his first day back at school after the funeral, how he refused to let go of my hand in the parking lot, even though the other children were already lining up, and how the teacher, a kind young woman who has surely retired by now, finally crouched down to his level and asked if he wanted to keep his father's picture in his desk where he could see it whenever he needed to. He nodded, and I watched through the window longer than I should have watched my 6-year-old son pull a small photograph out of his coat pocket one. I hadn't even known he'd taken from the mantel and tuck it carefully into the corner of his desk before opening his workbook like nothing at all had happened. I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried harder than I had at the funeral itself, because grief in private is one thing. But watching a child learn that young how to carry sorrow quietly enough not to bother anyone else with it, that is a different kind of grief altogether, one I don't think I ever fully recovered from even all these years later. I met Walter the summer I turned 19 at a church supper 2 towns over where my mother had dragged me to help set tables I had no interest in setting. He was not the kind of man anyone would have called handsome in a magazine sort of way, tall and a little too thin ears that stuck out slightly under a haircut. He clearly gave himself, but he had a way of listening that I had never once seen in a boy that age, leaning forward like whatever you were saying might turn out to be the most important thing he heard all week. He asked me that first evening what I wanted to do with my life, and when I told him I wanted to sew, actually sew, not just mend hems for spending money, he didn't laugh the way most boys did. He asked what kind of machine I'd need and how much one cost, like it was already a plan worth taking seriously instead of a girl's passing fancy. We were married 11 months later in my mother's church, a dress I made myself out of fabric. Walter's own mother had saved for years without telling anyone why, and I remember standing at that altar thinking I had found the one person in the world who would never once make me feel small for wanting something of my own. I was right about that for the whole of the time I got to keep him, and I have spent every year since trying to hold on to the shape of a man who believed a woman's ambitions were worth financing rather than managing. Dwight was supposed to pick me up at 9. I checked my phone at 8:50, then 8:55, then 9:02. The way you do when you're excited and trying not to look excited even to yourself. And then it buzzed. I remember exactly where I was standing. Right by the counter, one hand on my tote bag strap, the other reaching for my phone like it was going to hand me something good. "Mom, we've decided you're not coming on the cruise this time. We want it to be just family." I read it twice. Then a third time because the words didn't rearrange themselves into something kinder no matter how many times I looked at them. Just family. As if I were something else. As if 34 years of standing in that shop until my knees ached of driving casseroles to their door, when Winnie had the flu of always paying the mortgage, the car, the renovation, the emergency. That was never really an emergency but felt urgent enough that I never once said no, as if none of that had earned me a seat on a boat. My hands started shaking before my mind caught up to why. That's the strange thing about betrayal. The body knows first. I sat down on the arm of the sofa because my legs weren't fully convinced they could hold me. The tote bag slid off my shoulder onto the floor. I looked at it there, at the paperback spine curling out of the top at the candies I'd bought for a 5-year-old who wouldn't be handed to me that week after all, and something in my chest went very quiet. Not sad exactly. Quiet. Like a phone line going dead mid-sentence. Because I had just finished 3 days earlier paying off the final installment on their mortgage. The house on Larkspur Court. Their house everyone called it, though my name had been on that deed since the day Dwight and Marlene moved in, since the day I co-signed because their credit wasn't strong enough on its own, since the day I told myself it was temporary that we'd sort out the paperwork eventually that family didn't need contracts. I had made the very last payment on a Friday. I remember because I'd stood at the kitchen counter afterward and cried a little happy tears thinking there. Done. One less thing weighing on all of us. I hadn't even told Dwight yet. I was going to tell him on the cruise over dinner some soft candlelit moment where I'd say the house is paid off, sweetheart, free and clear, and watch his face do something grateful. Instead, I was sitting on my own sofa with my tote bag on the floor and a text message that told me I wasn't real family. Those 3 days between the final payment and the cruise had felt at the time like some of the lightest days I'd had in years. I remember humming while I worked at the shop, something I hadn't done in longer than I could place, and Odell teasing me about it, asking what had gotten into me, and me telling her only that a weight had come off I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. I'd bought a new sun hat for the trip, wide-brimmed and a little more extravagant than I'd normally allow myself, and I'd tried it on in my bedroom mirror the night before, packing turning side to side, feeling something close to giddy about it in a way that embarrasses me a little even now to admit. I had pictured more than once during those 3 days the exact moment I'd tell Dwight the house was paid in full, imagining his face. imagining some warm, unhurried evening on that ship where the two of us might finally talk the way we used to. Before Marlene, before the wedding, before all the careful subtractions that had worn the closeness between us down to almost nothing, I had built an entire small future in my head out of those 3 days, brick by hopeful brick, and none of it, not one single piece of it, had survived past 9:02 that Saturday morning. I want to explain something about how it had gotten to this point, because it didn't happen in one text. It happened in 1,000 small subtractions. Since Dwight met Marlene since the wedding, Sunday dinners went from every week to every other week to whenever it's convenient. I noticed early on that Marlene rarely used my name at all if she could help it. Not wrong, not right, just absent a small deliberate gap where a name should have gone, and I let it go because correcting an absence felt harder than correcting an error, and I have spent my whole life not making scenes. My voice was too loud at the dinner table, she said once, laughing like it was affectionate though nobody else laughed with her. My opinions were old-fashioned. My casseroles, she once mentioned to Dwight within my hearing, were a lot of butter for people watching their weight. Small things. Small enough that if I'd said anything, I would have been the one who overreacted. Which is exactly how it's designed to work, I understand that now. You get shaved down one sliver at a time until there's nothing left to defend because you can't point to any single cut and call it a wound. And still I kept showing up. When the kitchen renovation ran over budget, I covered the difference, $11,000. No argument, no promissory note, because what kind of mother makes her son sign a note? When Marlene's car broke down, I handed her mine for 6 weeks and drove Walter's old truck instead. The one that still smelled faintly of the cigarettes he'd quit years before he ever got sick, because some smells just live in the upholstery, long after the man who left them there is gone. When the pandemic hit and Dwight's hours got cut, I wired money into their account without being asked when I'd get it back, because you don't ask your own child for a receipt. I was invited to nothing that mattered near the end. Winnie's baby shower I found out about from a mutual friend 3 weeks after it happened. Their anniversary party I learned about through a photograph online, the whole gathering laughing around a cake with gold candles and me, not even a blank space in the frame, because I had never been asked to stand in it. Winnie's schedule is very fixed. Verna Marlene told me once flat when I asked about taking my granddaughter to lunch for her birthday. Maybe wait for a more suitable occasion. That occasion never came, so when the text arrived that morning, it didn't feel like the beginning of something. It felt like the final period at the end of a sentence that had been running for years. I sat there a long time, long enough that the gold light through the kitchen window shifted and thinned. And somewhere in that stillness, something changed in me. Not grief exactly. Grief I understood. This was different. Clean. Cold. Like a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. I picked my phone back up, not to answer him, to check something else entirely. Because the cruise had been booked months earlier under my credit card. My idea at the time, a gift, wouldn't it be lovely if I handled the deposit and you two paid me back whenever? Which of course they never had. I opened the banking app with fingers that weren't quite steady yet, and I watched the charges load in one after another. A cabana rental. 2 spa treatments. A bottle of champagne with a name I couldn't pronounce, $42 delivered to a stateroom that wasn't mine. All of it that same morning. While I was still sitting on my sofa reading a text that told me I wasn't real family, they were already spending my money to celebrate not needing me. I didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything else that day. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt something settle into my spine straight and quiet the way a seam sets, once you've pressed it properly. Once you've stopped fighting the fabric and let it lie the way it actually wants to lie. I want to tell you what happened next wasn't planned in that moment. It wasn't. I didn't leap off that sofa with a scheme already forming. What happened was smaller and slower than that. I sat there until the light in the kitchen had gone from gold to something flatter, more ordinary, and I thought about my own mother, who used to tell me that a woman who gives everything away and keeps nothing back for herself is not being generous. She's being careless with the only thing she truly owns. I hadn't understood that as a young woman. I understood it that morning, sitting alone with a tote bag on the floor and a phone still warm in my hand. I stood up. I walked into my study, the little room off the hallway that still had Walter's old desk in it, oak, scarred along one edge where Dwight used to do his homework and dig his pencil in too hard when he was frustrated with long division. And I opened the bottom drawer where I kept the folder I hadn't looked inside in years. Blue folder edges soft from age. The deed to the house on Larkspur Court. I had laid the maxi dress out on the bed the night before, smoothed flat the way I used to lay out a bride's gown before a fitting so I could see the whole shape of it at once instead of piece by piece. I had packed and repacked the tote twice, once for practicality, and once quietly for how it would look if anyone happened to photograph us boarding, though I never said that second reason out loud, even to myself, until much later. I had imagined more than once in the weeks leading up to that morning sitting across from Winnie at some little table on the ship with her feet swinging under the chair, teaching her to fold a napkin, the way my own mother had taught me. Some small ordinary inheritance passed down, the way those things are supposed to pass quietly over years without anyone remarking on it. I had imagined Dwight relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him in longer than I could name sun on his shoulders, some of the tightness gone out of him that had lived there since the wedding. I want you to understand how full that morning was, how much I had built inside it, before a single word of the text message ever reached me, because it matters. I think how far a person falls when the floor they were standing on turns out never to have been solid in the first place. I want to be honest with you. I had told myself more than once that I should transfer that house into their names properly. Dwight had asked gently a few times over the years. "Why would you do that, Mom?" He'd say we're family, as if the word itself was supposed to settle the matter on its own, without any further discussion required. And every time I meant to do it. Every time something in me hesitated, some old instinct I never examined closely enough to name. Call it the small, quiet part of a woman who has been disappointed before, and learns eventually to keep one door unlocked behind her, even when she can't say exactly why. I never signed the transfer. I told myself it was procrastination, plain forgetfulness, a task that kept sliding to the bottom of a longer list. Looking at that folder now in that thin afternoon light, I understood it had been something closer to wisdom arriving decades before I was ready to receive it. I sat at Walter's desk and I went through every page. The deed, the mortgage documents with my signature on every single one going back years, my handwriting getting smaller and more careful with each renewal, the way handwriting does as a woman gets older and starts to trust her hand less, receipts for payments going back 5 years. Some of them handwritten, because in the early days I still wrote checks and kept the stubs the way my mother taught me in a green metal box that used to sit on top of the refrigerator. $11,000 for the renovation, no note attached anywhere. $2,300 for the car repair, Marlene never mentioned again after it was finished. Property taxes for the last 3 years taken entirely from what should have been sitting quietly in my retirement account, growing instead of disappearing. I sat there until the light outside had gone from gold to a flat, ordinary afternoon white, and I made a decision so calm it frightened me a little. No shouting, no confrontation on the phone where Marlene could turn it into a story about a hysterical mother-in-law losing her composure over a family vacation. I would be quiet. I would be exact. I would find out precisely what I had a right to do, and then I would do it one careful step at a time, the way I'd learned to do everything that mattered. I called Foster Kilbride the next morning. Foster had handled small things for me over the years, a dispute with a landlord, back when I still rented my shop space, the paperwork when I finally bought the building outright, with money I'd saved a little at a time for almost a decade. 10 years more or less of trusting him with things that mattered to me, and never once being disappointed in that trust. His office was on the second floor above a hardware store, the kind of building that still had a hand-cranked elevator gate nobody used because everyone preferred the stairs. And I remember standing in front of it that morning, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger exactly. Resolve. The kind that doesn't announce itself with noise. Foster had lost his own wife some years back. Not to illness the way Hollis had, but to a divorce that had apparently gone about as ugly as divorces are permitted to go in this state. And though he never discussed it directly with me, Odell had mentioned it once in passing, the way small towns pass information, along without anyone quite intending to gossip. I think that history was part of why he understood without my having to explain it twice exactly what I meant when I said I didn't want revenge. Only fairness, and exactly why a person might spend years hesitating over paperwork that would have made her more vulnerable, rather than less, even to people she loved. He never once made me feel foolish for that hesitation. He only ever made me feel sitting across from his desk like a woman whose caution had finally been proven wise instead of paranoid, which is a rare enough gift from any professional, let alone one you're paying to tell you the truth whether or not it flatters you. Foster's assistant showed me in, and he stood to greet me the way he always did. Warm, unhurried, the sort of man who made you feel like whatever you'd brought him was the only thing on his desk that day, even when it clearly wasn't. I set the blue folder down in front of him without much explanation. "Just I need you to look at something. Larkspur Court." whose name is actually on this." He put on his reading glasses. He went through the documents slower than I expected, pausing on certain pages, flipping back to compare dates, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, trying to look like a woman who wasn't holding her breath, though I was. "Verna," he said, finally setting the folder down flat on the desk between us. "Legally, this house is yours. Only yours. There was never a transfer filed. Not even a partial one. Not so much as an intention documented anywhere in these pages." I want to describe what that sentence did to the air in that room, because it wasn't relief exactly. It was something closer to vindication mixed with grief, both arriving at once, tangled together so tightly I couldn't tell where one started and the other ended. Vindication, because some small, tired part of me had been right to hesitate all those years, right not to hand it over the way everyone told me family was supposed to do without asking questions. And grief, because I understood sitting there in that office with the hardware store's delivery trucks rumbling faintly below the window that I was about to use that fact. That the woman who had spent her whole life giving without conditions was about to discover exactly what conditions she'd had all along, hidden underneath the giving like a seam you don't see until the fabric finally tears along it. Which meant I could sell it. Anytime. Without asking permission. Without warning them at all. "What about their things?" I asked. "What happens to what's inside?" "You give them a reasonable window to remove personal belongings," Foster said. 30 days is standard practice." I nodded slowly. Outside, a truck backed up somewhere, that flat electronic beeping sound, and I found myself thinking of Winnie's little shoes lined up by their front door. The ones with the light-up soles. She loved to stomp in the dark hallway just to watch them flash red and blue against the baseboards. I pushed the thought away. Not because it didn't matter. Because it mattered too much, and I couldn't afford not yet to let it slow me down before I'd even finished deciding. "I don't want to hurt them," I told Foster, and I meant it. "I don't want revenge." He took his glasses off and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful, the look of a man weighing how much truth a person can hold in one sitting. "Then what do you want, Verna?" I thought about the text message. Just family. I thought about the champagne charged to my card while I sat frozen on my own sofa. I thought about 34 years of Sunday dinners that thinned into nothing of a granddaughter's birthday I learned about from a photograph instead of an invitation of a lifetime spent making myself smaller so no one else would have to feel the size of what I was giving them. I want them to understand, I said, that everything has a cost. Even love. Especially love when it's only ever asked for and never once returned. Foster was quiet a moment. Then he opened a legal pad and clicked his pen, the small sound of it very loud in that hushed office, and he said, "All right. Let's talk about how we do this properly, start to finish, so there's no question later about whether you had every right." We spent nearly an hour going through it line by line, the way I used to go through a pattern before I ever let scissors touch fabric, because a woman only gets to cut once, and I had learned long ago that the cutting is the one part of the process you cannot take back. Foster explained the notice requirements, the storage laws, the language a letter like that needed to contain to hold up, if anyone ever tried to argue. I hadn't given fair warning. I asked more questions than I think he expected, and he answered everyone patiently without once looking at me, the way people sometimes look at a woman my age asking detailed questions about her own legal rights, as though surprised she had thought to ask at all. By the time we finished, I had a plan with a shape to it, dates and steps instead of just a feeling sitting hot in my chest, and something in me settled slightly further, the way it does once you've moved a thing from your body into a document where it can be handled with 2 hands instead of carried alone. I left his office a little after noon that day and stood on the sidewalk for a while before walking to my car. The town moved around me the way it always did, ordinary and different, a delivery truck idling, 2 teenagers laughing over something on a phone, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to sniff every mailbox post along the block. None of them knew that the woman standing very still on the sidewalk beside them had just been told in plain legal language that the ground under her feet had never actually belonged to anyone but her. I thought about Winnie's laugh, that particular hiccuping giggle she'd had since she was a baby. I thought about Dwight as a small boy, 6 years old, standing at Walter's graveside in a clip-on tie that didn't sit right, holding my hand so tightly it left marks on my fingers that lasted into the evening. I thought about the woman I had been for 34 years, the one who paid without asking, who showed up without being invited, who loved out loud and absorbed the silence that came back to her, without ever once naming it as unfair, because naming it felt like admitting she'd been keeping score all along. That woman was still in me somewhere. I could feel her worried aching, already half regretting a decision I hadn't fully made yet. But there was someone else standing beside her now. Someone quieter. Someone who had just learned her own name, was the only one on the deed, and who intended for the first time in longer than she could remember to act like it. I got into my car, and I did not cry, and I did not call my son, and I drove home through streets I had lived on for over 3 decades, past the shop with my name still stitched into the awning in faded gold thread, past the church where Walter's funeral had been held, past all the small landmarks of a life spent giving itself away, one careful stitch at a time. And somewhere in that drive, I understood that whatever happened next, I would not be the same woman who had put on a floral dress that morning, believing she was finally at 66 years old, about to be given something back. The days after that meeting with Foster moved differently than ordinary days. I noticed that first, how time seemed to thicken once I had made a decision instead of just carrying a wound around inside me, unattended the way a wound left too long starts to ache in weather changes. I woke early without an alarm. I made coffee and drank it slowly on my back steps, watching the light come up over the fence line, and for the first time in longer than I could name, I wasn't waiting for my phone to buzz with something that would disappoint me. Foster had given me the name of a real estate agent. He trusted a woman named Corinne Vashti who worked mostly with clients who needed things handled quietly, discreetly, without a story attached to it, that the whole street could gossip about over their own back fences. No sign in the yard. No open house with strangers wandering through rooms that still smelled like someone else's life. Just a fast, clean process and a serious buyer who wouldn't drag things out for months while lawyers argued over closing dates. I called her from my kitchen table with the blue folder open in front of me, and when she asked what kind of timeline I was hoping for, I surprised myself with how steady my voice came out. As fast as it can happen, I told her, without anyone knowing until it's already done. She didn't ask why. I think women who do that kind of work learn early not to ask why. She said the location was strong, that a house like that wouldn't sit long on the market if the price was fair, and I told her I didn't want to profit off it. I wanted what was owed to me, nothing more. Nothing padded to punish anyone further than the truth already would. Corinne said she'd have serious interest within 2 weeks, maybe less, and something in her tone told me she meant it. I went to the shop the next morning the same as any other day, because I had learned by then that grief and resolve both need somewhere ordinary to live while they finish taking shape, and my hands needed the machine more than my mind needed to sit still with itself. Odell came in that week with a coat that needed nothing more than a button and stayed longer than the button required, talking about her granddaughter's wedding, and I nodded along and pinned the fabric and said nothing at all about what was quietly moving through Corinne's office 3 blocks away. It felt strange some days to be 2 women at once, the one measuring a hem with steady hands, and the one who had just signed away without a word to anyone the house her own son slept in. But I had spent 34 years learning how to hold more than one thing at a time without dropping either, and I found that week that the skill hadn't left me even now. It was while I was going through the study, pulling together old documents. Foster wanted copies of that I found the letters. They were in a shoebox at the back of Walter's closet, the one closet in the house I had never fully cleared out, even all these years after he died, because some rooms you keep closed, not out of neglect, but out of a kind of mercy toward yourself. A place you allow to stay exactly as it was, so some part of the person can keep living there undisturbed. The box had his handwriting on the lid, just the word Verna, nothing else. And I sat down right there on the closet floor with my knees complaining about it, and lifted the lid like it might still be able to hurt me if I moved too fast. Letters, dozens of them. Some dated back to when we were only newly married, before Dwight was even born, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, soft as something worn rather than something written. I hadn't known he kept these. I had written him letters back then, 2 silly things, notes tucked into his lunch pail before he left for the plant in the mornings, and somehow he had saved every single one, kept them hidden in a box in a closet for over 3 decades, without ever once mentioning it to me. Not even in passing, not even on an anniversary when it might have made a sweet thing to bring up over dinner. I read one dated the spring before Dwight was born. Walter's handwriting was small and careful, the handwriting of a man who never wasted anything, not paper, not words, not affection. He wasn't sure yet how to spend. He wrote about how he used to watch me sew in the evenings, and think that he had never seen anyone give so much of herself to something, and ask for so little back in return. He wrote that he worried about it sometimes, in the quiet way men of his generation worried about things they couldn't quite bring themselves to say out loud in daylight. That a heart like mine, so willing to pour itself out, might someday be poured into people who didn't know how to hold it carefully. that he hoped whoever those people turned out to be, they would learn in time. And if they didn't, he hoped I would learn eventually when to stop pouring. I sat on that closet floor, and I cried for the first time since the text message had arrived. And it wasn't grief for Walter exactly, though it was that too, always that too in some low current running underneath everything else. It was something closer to recognition, because here was a man gone more than 30 years now who had seen this coming before I ever did, who had loved me enough to worry about the exact thing that was happening to me now, sitting in a house that would soon no longer be mine to protect, holding a letter written before our son had even taken his first breath. There was another letter further down in the box written the week Dwight was born, the handwriting shakier than the rest, the way a man's hand shakes when he's writing at 3 in the morning in a hospital waiting room with too much coffee and too little sleep in him. He wrote that he'd held his son for the first time that evening and felt for a moment like the luckiest man in the state, and that he hoped whatever kind of man Dwight grew into, he would learn to notice when someone was giving him more than they had to spare. He wrote that he already worried even then, even with the baby not yet a day old, that a boy raised by a mother so endlessly capable might grow up believing capability was the same thing as bottomless, that a woman who never seemed to run out of anything could simply be trusted never to. I read that line 4 times in the dark of that closet, my knees aching against the hardwood, and I thought of Dwight at 40, sitting across from me in a conference room asking how I could do this to my own son, and I understood with a clarity that nearly took my breath that Walter had named the whole of it 34 years before it ever happened, before Dwight had even opened his eyes for the first time. I didn't tell Foster about the letters. I didn't tell anyone. I just kept the box beside my bed after that, and some nights I'd read one before falling asleep, like Walter was still somewhere in the house, reminding me that being loved correctly was supposed to feel different than what I'd been settling for, that it wasn't supposed to cost me my whole self just to keep it, which made the decision easier somehow. Not colder, easier, because I wasn't doing this out of spite anymore if I ever had been in the first place. I was doing it because a man who loved me right had warned me decades before I was ready to hear it about a wound I hadn't known yet how to name, and it seemed finally like the least I could do for his memory was to name it now. Meanwhile, across an ocean of blue water, I had helped pay for Dwight, and Marlene were living exactly the life they'd chosen instead of me. I know because the photographs kept arriving, not sent to me, never sent to me, but visible anyway, the way things are visible now, whether you want them to be or not, whether you go looking for them, or they simply appear in front of you through some mutual friend's account. Marlene in a white dress against a railing champagne glass lifted toward a sunset that looked almost too perfect to be entirely real. A private dinner on some upper deck candlelight, the two of them laughing at something outside the frame. And underneath every photograph in small letters, I made myself read even though it hurt the charges kept coming through on my card. A couple's massage. A shore excursion in some port with turquoise water I will never see in person. A bottle of wine that cost more than I used to make in a week when I was starting out with nothing but a rented storefront and a singer machine that groaned on every pedal. I froze the card 2 days before they were due to fly home. I blocked both their numbers that same afternoon. Not out of anger, though the anger was there, sitting low and steady in my chest, like a coal that doesn't need tending to keep burning quietly. I did it because Foster had told me gently that once things were in motion, all communication needed to run through his office. Clean lines. No emotional appeals slipping through a text message at midnight to soften my resolve before it had time to finish setting properly the way you never touch a seam before the iron has had its full minute to hold. Corinne called on a Tuesday morning, her voice bright with the kind of satisfaction agents get when a deal comes together faster than promised. A couple wanting to close quickly, she said. Full price offer. Ready to sign whenever I was no negotiation needed, no repairs requested, nothing but a clean transaction between two parties who wanted the same thing at the same speed. I signed 2 days later. The whole transaction moved with a speed that still astonishes me when I think back on it now. Papers exchanged funds, transferred keys handed to strangers who would sleep that week in the bedroom where Winnie used to nap on Sunday afternoons in the kitchen, where I'd once stood mixing batter for a birthday cake. Nobody invited me to see her blow the candles out on. Corinne offered to handle the final walkthrough herself, spare me from having to stand in those rooms one more time. But I told her no, I wanted to see it once more before it stopped being mine in any sense at all. I drove out on a quiet weekday morning while Dwight and Marlene were still somewhere over open water, and I let myself in with the key I still carried on my ring out of habit, and I walked through rooms that already felt like they belonged to someone else, stripped of the small clutter of a life still being lived in them, because Foster had advised keeping the house presentable and mostly empty of anything valuable while things were in motion. I stood a long moment in what had been Winnie's room, the pale yellow walls still marked faintly where a shelf used to hang, and I let myself feel the whole of it, the years of Sunday naps and bedtime stories before I turned the light off and closed the door behind me for the last time as anyone's grandmother's house. It was, I think, the only time in that entire ordeal that I let myself grieve the house itself rather than only what it represented, and I was glad afterward that I had given myself that hour alone with it before handing the rooms over to strangers entirely. I chose the closing date carefully, not randomly. I asked Corinne to time the final walk through the handover of keys for the exact afternoon Dwight and Marlene were scheduled to land back home from the cruise. I want to be honest about why. Some petty wounded part of me wanted them to walk up that driveway still tanned and pleased with themselves, and find out all at once in a single unbearable moment exactly what they'd traded away for a week of being just family without me in the frame. But there was a colder, steadier part too, the part that had read Foster's advice and understood he was right about the mechanics of it. A slow reveal gives people time to prepare a defense to call a lawyer before I'd even finished explaining myself in my own words. A fast one leaves no room for anything except the truth arriving all at once, undeniable, already notarized, already beyond the reach of argument. I wrote the letter myself, though. Foster's office printed it on their letterhead, so there could be no mistaking it for something emotional, something I might later be accused of having said in anger during a moment of weakness. I kept the words plain. This property has been legally sold. Your personal belongings have been placed in secure storage. You have 30 days to arrange collection through this office. All communication should be directed to the undersigned attorney. I did not sign my own name to it. I let the letterhead speak instead. Because somewhere inside me, even then I understood that this wasn't really Verna Ostrander closing a door on her son. This was the law, plain and cold, and entirely indifferent to how many casseroles I had carried up that driveway over the years, simply confirming what had been true the whole time. The house had never belonged to anyone but me. I had the letter taped to the front door myself. I drove there that morning before the new owners arrived to walk through, and I stood on the porch where I used to stand years earlier, holding a sleeping Winnie against my shoulder, while Dwight fumbled with his house keys, and Marlene called something impatient from inside, and I pressed the tape down at all 4 corners so the coastal wind wouldn't take it before they arrived to read it. My hands were steady. I want to say that plainly because I expected them not to be. I expected to feel like I was doing something cruel. What I felt instead was the strange, hollow calm of a woman finishing a piece of alterations work she had put off for far too long, snipping the last loose thread and stepping back to see the whole garment finally hang the way it was always meant to. Then I drove away and did not look back at the house in my mirror, because I already knew exactly what it looked like, and I had decided I no longer needed to carry that particular picture with me any further into the rest of my life. The calls started that same evening. I know because Foster told me the next morning, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who has spent an entire evening being shouted at by people who are not technically his clients, but who clearly believed shouting might work anyway, given enough volume and enough repetition. Dwight had called his office 4 times. Marlene twice, though her calls Foster said were shorter, sharper, less interested in explanations, and more interested in threats about lawyers of their own. They want a meeting, Foster told me over the phone. Just Dwight. At my office, not anywhere private where things could get complicated or emotional in a way that might not serve either of you well. I think that's wise given everything that's happened this week. I agreed, though something in my stomach dropped at the idea of sitting across from my son in a room that smelled like legal paper and old coffee, watching his face understand in real time. Exactly what his mother had done while he was still tanned from a week of sun, he'd never once thought to share with her. The meeting was set for the following morning. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with Walter's shoebox on the nightstand beside me, and at some point past midnight I reached over and took out the letter I'd already read twice, the one about my heart being poured into people who didn't know how to hold it carefully, and I read it a 3rd time in the dark, by the light of my phone, and I thought, Walter, I hope I am doing this right. I hope this is what you meant all those years ago, and not something harder, something I still haven't earned the wisdom to understand. I dressed with more care than the occasion probably called for. A pale blue blouse that always made me feel steadier than I actually was. My hair pulled back low and simple. A little lipstick not for vanity, but because I needed to look like a woman who had decided something, not a woman who had been driven to something against her will. There's a difference, and I wanted Dwight to see it the moment he walked through that door. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in Foster's small conference room with my hands folded on the table, watching the second hand move around the clock on the wall, listening to the hardware store trucks rumble past below the window, same as they had the day I first walked in with the blue folder. When the door finally opened and Dwight stepped through, I almost didn't recognize him for a second. Not because he looked different exactly, because he looked smaller. Dark circles carved deep under his eyes like he'd aged a decade in the handful of days since he'd come home to a letter taped to a door that no longer belonged to him. He sat down across from me without being asked. For a long moment neither of us said anything at all, and I let that silence stretch, because I had spent 34 years rushing to fill silences with reassurance. And I had decided somewhere in the last week that I was finally done doing that for people who never once rushed to fill mine. "Mom," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly on the single word. "Why did you do this to us?" I looked at him a long moment before I answered, and when I did, my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I think he expected either. "I didn't do anything to you, Dwight. I exercised a right over property that has always legally belonged to me." He ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture he'd had since he was a teenager, frustrated with homework at Walter's old desk, and something in me ached at the familiarity of it even as I made myself stay still, made myself not reach across the table the way every instinct in my body wanted to. "That's our house," he said. "We've lived there 5 years. You've lived in a house with my name on the deed," I told him, "where I made nearly every mortgage payment myself, where the property taxes for the last 3 years came directly out of my retirement account. Which you knew. Which you must have known, Dwight, because you were the one who told me not to worry about the paperwork. Family doesn't need contracts, you said. Do you remember saying that to me more than once whenever I brought it up?" I didn't answer. His jaw worked like he wanted to, like the words were somewhere behind his teeth and he couldn't get them to move forward into sound. "We were going to pay you back," he said finally. "We always said we would eventually once things settled." When I asked, "When you had money for spa treatments and champagne on a boat, but never enough to send back what you owed me. When you texted me that I wasn't real family." His eyes came up sharply at that, hearing his own words handed back to him in my voice instead of his, and for a moment I watched something crumble slightly in his face, some defense he'd built overnight finally cracking under its own weight, unable to hold. That was he started and stopped. That was a mistake. Marlene was stressed about the trip, and I shouldn't have sent it that way, I know that now. But Mom, we still have to live somewhere. You can't just... I cut in before he could keep building the sentence into something that might soften me back into the woman who always found a way to make things easier for everyone but herself. "We're not here to trade excuses," I told him. "We're here to talk about next steps. Your things have been placed in storage. You have 30 days. If you need more time, you can request it formally through this office." "So where are we supposed to go?" he asked. And there was real fear in it now, not performance, not manipulation. Just a grown man realizing all at once that the floor he'd assumed would always be there had quietly been someone else's the whole time. "Did you even think about that before you did this?" "I thought about it the same way I thought about it standing at the pier with my suitcase packed, watching a boat leave without me," I said. "You're an adult, Dwight. You have a job. You'll find a place the same way any other couple starting out would." The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes in total, though it felt sitting inside it like something that stretched far longer, the way certain conversations expand to fill whatever grief you bring into the room with them, no matter how short the clock says they actually were. When Dwight finally stood to leave, he paused at the door, and for just a moment I thought he might apologize, might say something that would let me set down some small piece of the weight I was carrying. Instead, he just looked at me, hollow exhausted, and said quietly, "I don't understand how you could do this to your own son." I watched him go. I did not run after him. I did not soften. But I want to be honest because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would be honest even about the parts that don't make me look strong. After the door closed behind him, I sat alone in that conference room for a long while, and I let myself cry quietly into a tissue, Foster's assistant brought in without being asked. Because some part of me was still, and maybe always would be, his mother first, and a woman defending her own name. Second, no matter how carefully I dressed that morning to look otherwise. I drove straight to the shop afterward instead of going home because home that day felt like a room with nothing in it to hold on to, and I needed my hands busy on something that would still be exactly where I left it in an hour. I had a wedding dress waiting on the form near the back. A client's daughter getting married in the spring yards of ivory silk that needed the waist taken in a full 1.5 inches, And I worked that seam slowly, carefully, the way you work something when your hands are the only steady part of you left. A little bell rang twice that afternoon, customers coming and going, and I smiled and spoke to each of them the way I always had, and not one of them could have guessed, looking at the woman pinning their hem, that she had spent the morning telling her own son he had 30 days to remove his belongings from a house he no longer owned. I have thought about that since, how much a person can carry behind an ordinary face. How many women pin a stranger's hem with a whole private storm sitting quietly behind their eyes? The bride's name was Priscilla Dunmore, and she came in for her fitting 3 days later, a bright young woman in her 20s, with the particular glow of someone who still believes every hard thing in her life will simply resolve itself if she waits long enough and loves hard enough. She stood on the little platform in front of my 3-way mirror while I pinned the waist, and she talked the whole time about her mother, who didn't approve of the fiancé, and her future mother-in-law, who kept suggesting changes to the guest list that would have quietly erased half of Priscilla's own family from the day. I listened the way I always listened to brides, half professional and half something closer to a confessor. And at one point she looked at me in the mirror and asked plainly whether it got easier, the business of blending one family into another without losing pieces of yourself along the way. I told her the honest thing, which was that it didn't get easier so much as it got clearer, that eventually you learned exactly which pieces of yourself were worth defending and which ones you could afford to let soften, and that the trouble mostly came from waiting too long to figure out the difference. She nodded slowly, the pins glinting in the mirror between us, and said she hoped she'd be brave enough to know the difference when it mattered. I told her I hoped so too, and I meant it more than she could have known, standing there with my own family quietly falling apart 3 blocks away while I finished the last pin in her waistline. My sister called that same afternoon. Faye and I had never been close in the way some sisters are, but we talked enough, checked in enough, that I wasn't surprised to hear her voice on the line, sounding tight with something she'd clearly been rehearsing on the drive to wherever she was calling from. "Verna, are you out of your mind?" she said, no greeting first. Dwight called me in tears. "How could you sell their house?" "It isn't their house, Faye," I said. "It's mine. It has always been mine on paper, and in every payment that ever kept it standing." "But he's your son," she said, like that single fact was supposed to settle every argument on its own, the way it always had for people like Faye. People who believed family forgave everything, simply because it was family, no accounting required. I took a breath before I answered. "That word," I told her. "Family. Do you know how many years I've heard that word used on me like a leash? When money was needed, I was family. When someone needed a babysitter so they could go out for the evening, I was family. But the moment it came time to actually include me in something that cost them nothing but a little room on a boat, suddenly I wasn't real family at all. You tell me, Faye, which version of that word I'm supposed to keep believing in." Faye was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and I braced myself for whatever came next, because Faye had never been someone who backed down easily from a position once she'd taken it, not since we were girls sharing a bedroom and arguing over whose turn it was for the good pillow. "So where are they supposed to live now?" she finally asked, her voice a little less certain than before, a little less rehearsed. "They're adults," I told her. "They have jobs. They have savings, or they should if they hadn't spent what little they had on a cruise instead of paying back what they owed me. They'll find a place to rent, same as anyone else starting over would have to." And after I hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, the shoebox of Walter's letters still sitting on my nightstand upstairs unopened that particular evening, because I didn't need to read his words again to know what he would have said. He would have told me I had done the hard thing instead of the easy thing, and that those were rarely the same choice, and that loving someone correctly sometimes looked from the outside exactly like not loving them enough. I didn't feel triumphant that night. I want to say that clearly, because revenge stories are supposed to end their chapters with some taste of victory, some clean satisfaction settling into the chest of the woman who finally stood up for herself. What I felt instead, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the porch light still on outside, though no one was coming, was something far quieter and far more complicated. Relief, yes, but grief laid right alongside it, so close together, I couldn't always tell where one ended and the other one began. Because somewhere in that boy who'd sat across from me shaking, asking how I could do this to my own son, there was still the 6-year-old who had held my hand too tightly at his father's graveside. And I understood even then, even that first difficult night, that whatever came next between us would never again be simple, and that some part of me would spend a long while grieving the version of this family that never had to arrive at a courtroom or a conference room to know what it owed each other. The letter from Maxine Follett arrived 9 days after I'd taped that notice to the door on Larkspur Court. 9 days of silence so complete I'd started to wonder if I would simply live inside it forever, a woman alone in a beachfront rental with a shoebox of old letters and a business that still somehow needed tending, no matter how much my personal life had come apart at the seams. I found the envelope in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and looping the kind of penmanship women my age were taught in schools that don't much exist anymore. I almost didn't open it right away. I stood at the mailbox a long moment, turning it over in my hands, because any unfamiliar handwriting felt in those weeks like it might be another blow disguised as something ordinary, another envelope full of consequences I hadn't yet accounted for. But I opened it there on the sidewalk because I have never in my life been a woman who could carry an unopened envelope back into her house without knowing what was inside it first. Verna T. began. I know we've never been close, and I understand why you might not want to hear from anyone connected to this mess. But I'm writing because Winnie keeps asking for you. She doesn't understand any of what's happened between the adults, only that her grandmother has disappeared from her life, and that isn't right. Whatever is happening with the house, whatever anyone deserves or doesn't deserve a 5-year-old, shouldn't lose the person who bakes her cookies and reads her the same book 4 times in a row without ever once complaining about it. I read it standing on the sidewalk with my mail still gathered against my chest, and something in me that had gone very still since that morning on the sofa finally cracked open just slightly right down the center, the way ice does before it gives way entirely and lets the water underneath finally move again. Because I hadn't let myself think about Winnie. Not really. I had thought about the deed, the mortgage, the champagne charged to my card, the letter on Foster's stationery, but I had kept my granddaughter carefully out of that reasoning the way you keep a lit candle away from something you can't afford to catch fire. Until that envelope arrived and put her right back in the center of everything small and real and asking for me by name in her own small voice according to a woman I barely knew. I wrote back that same afternoon, my hand not quite steady on the pen. I told Maxine I missed Winnie every single day, that I had never intended to be away from her, that whatever had happened between the adults was never meant to touch her at all, not for one single hour. If it was allowed, I said if Dwight and Marlene were willing, I would love nothing more than an afternoon with her, however brief, however supervised, whatever it took. The reply came within hours. Maxine had spoken to them. She couldn't promise anything, but she would try, and I could tell from the careful way she'd written it that trying for her meant something more difficult than the word usually implied. 3 days later, another letter, this one shorter. They had agreed with conditions, supervised, 2 hours only. Maxine present the entire time, start to finish. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading those conditions and feeling something twist low in my stomach, something close to insult, as though after everything, after 34 years of driving Winnie to appointments and rocking her through fevers, and never once being anything but soft with that child, someone now believed I needed watching, needed supervising, as if I were the danger in this story, rather than the woman who had simply stopped paying for her own erasure. But I folded the anger up small and put it away, because 2 supervised hours were still 2 hours more than the silence I'd been living inside, and I had learned by then which battles were worth the cost of fighting and which ones only cost you more than they could ever give back. Sunday came bright and warm, the kind of morning that makes the ocean look like it's been polished overnight by someone with more patience than any person actually has. I baked the chocolate cookies. Winnie loved the recipe I'd been making since she was old enough to steal raw dough off the spoon when she thought I wasn't watching, and I set up a little nook on my balcony with cushions and a stack of picture books I still had from Dwight's own childhood, their spines soft with age and handling. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in years. Nervous the way you are before something you want too badly to trust. It will actually happen the way you've pictured it. The doorbell rang right on time. Maxine stood there with Winnie's small hand in hers, and the moment my granddaughter saw me, she let go and ran, arms already lifting before she'd even crossed the threshold, and I bent down and caught her the way I used to catch her when she was barely walking unsteady on her feet, and the smell of her hair, that particular mix of children's shampoo and sunshine, and something that was simply unmistakably her, undid something in my chest completely all at once. No warning. "Grandma," she said into my shoulder, and I held her there a long moment before I trusted my voice enough to answer without it breaking. "I've missed you so much, sweetheart," I told her, and I meant it with my whole body, every year of it. Those 2 hours went by the way. Water goes through your fingers fast, and impossible to hold on to properly, no matter how tightly you try to close your hand around it. She showed me a drawing she'd made of a house with too many windows and a sun in the corner with a smiling face drawn in careful yellow crayon. She told me about a boy in her class who ate paste, which she found deeply scandalous, and reported to me twice in case I hadn't fully absorbed the gravity of it the first time. She asked at one point, staring out at the ocean with her small hands wrapped around a cookie, why Grandma didn't live at the old house anymore, and I felt Maxine go very still behind us, watching to see how I'd answer a question that had no honest version simple enough for a 5-year-old to carry. Grandma has a new place now, sweetie, I said carefully. Right by the water. Isn't that lucky? She seemed to accept that the way children accept most things, adults hand them without the full weight of it pressing down on her, the way it would on an adult, and went back to her cookie, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding since the doorbell rang. Near the end of that first visit, I brought out a small embroidery hoop I'd set aside for her fabric already stretched, taut a needle threaded thick with bright red floss, and the point dulled down so it couldn't do more than prick a fingertip if she pushed too hard. I showed her how to bring the needle up through the back and down through the front. Slow, deliberate, the same motion my own mother had shown me at an age not so different from Winnie's. Her stitches came out crooked and enormous, nothing like a real seam, but she concentrated so hard, her small tongue poked out the corner of her mouth, and when she finally finished a single wobbling line across the fabric, she held it up like she'd built something out of nothing at all. "This is for you, Grandma," she said, and I told her honestly that it was the finest piece of needlework I'd ever received in my whole life, and I meant every word of it. I still have that scrap of fabric. I kept it pinned above my sewing table at the shop long after that first visit, a small crooked red line that meant more to me than anything I'd ever stitched myself. We read one of Dwight's old picture books together, the one about a rabbit who couldn't sleep, and Winnie insisted on doing the rabbit's voice herself, a high wobbling thing that made Maxine laugh out loud from her chair by the balcony door, despite herself. At one point, Winnie stopped mid-page and pressed her small palm flat against my cheek, studying my face the way children do when they're checking that something they remember still matches the thing in front of them, and said, "You look the same, Grandma," like she'd half expected 2 months apart to have changed me into someone else entirely. I told her I was exactly the same, which wasn't fully true, though it was true enough for a 5-year-old sitting in my lap with cookie crumbs on her shirt, and she seemed satisfied enough to go back to the rabbit and his troubles falling asleep. When the 2 hours ended, Maxine lingered a moment at the door after Winnie had already run ahead to the car, unable to sit still a second longer than necessary, the way children her age never could. "She misses you badly, Verna," she said quietly. "Whatever happens with the rest of it, whatever this becomes between the adults, I hope we can keep this part going, just the two of us managing it if we have to." I thanked her, and I meant that too, and I watched them drive away and stood on my own balcony afterward, with the ocean going gold in front of me and cookie crumbs still scattered across the little table, and I let myself cry, finally, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes after something has been given back to you instead of taken away. But the peace of that Sunday didn't last long. Foster called 2 days later, and I knew from the particular weight in his voice, before he'd said more than my name, that whatever came next wasn't going to be gentle, wasn't going to let me sit inside that Sunday feeling for much longer. "They've retained an attorney," he told me. "Dwight and Marlene both. They're planning to contest the sale of the house formally in writing." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. On what grounds, I asked, though some tired part of me already suspected the answer before he gave it to me. "They're claiming a verbal agreement," Foster said, "that you promised at some point over the years to eventually transfer the house into their names. They're also pointing to the mortgage payments they can document, making themselves arguing those payments implied an understanding of ownership that should carry legal weight, regardless of whose name sits on the deed." I closed my eyes, because there had been conversations over the years, soft ones, the kind where Dwight would say, "Someday, Mom, right, someday this will just be ours." And I would murmur something non-committal because saying no outright always felt crueler in the moment than it would have been kind in the long run. Those conversations had never once been a promise, not in my mind, not in anything I ever signed or said with intention. But I understood sitting there how easily a lawyer could dress them up to look like one if he tried hard enough, if he had a client desperate enough to let him try. "Do they have a real chance?" I asked. "Honestly, very small," Foster said. "Verbal agreements are difficult to prove without witnesses or documentation, and the fact they contributed some payments doesn't undo your legal ownership of record, not under the law as it currently stands. But I want you prepared. This could get slower and uglier before it gets simpler again." I thanked him and hung up, and I sat at my table a long while with my hands flat against the wood, trying to steady something in my chest that had started shaking again the moment he said the word contest, Because some part of me had believed foolishly maybe that the worst of it was already behind me, that the hardest door had already been closed and locked. It was 2 days after that call that Odell Ferris came into my life again, though of course I didn't know yet what she'd bring with her when she walked through my door with a coat over her arm like any other Tuesday. Odell had been a client of mine for almost 15 years, a retired school teacher who still brought me her good wool coats every autumn for the same small repairs. A loose button, a hem that had come down half an inch over the summer in the closet. She found me at the little rented storefront I'd taken on temporarily to keep working out of 3 blocks from my apartment, and she came in with a coat over her arm and a look on her face like she was carrying something she wasn't entirely sure she should hand over to me at all. "Verna," she said, setting the coat on my counter. "I wasn't sure whether to say anything, but I saw your daughter-in-law last week at the Halyard Inn out past the marina." I kept my hand steady on the coat, though something inside me had already gone very alert the way it does when a sentence starts ordinary, and you can feel it isn't going to end that way. "Marlene," I said. "Doing what?" "Having lunch," Odell said, carefully choosing her words the way a woman does when she knows she's about to change the shape of someone's afternoon. "With a man. I only noticed because they were sitting close heads together and she had papers spread out on the table between them. I wouldn't have thought twice except my niece works the front desk there, and she mentioned they'd met a few times before. Business, she assumed. Something about opening a shop downtown. I felt the floor tilt slightly under me, though I kept my face composed the way I'd trained myself to over 34 years of hearing difficult things from clients, and never once letting my expression give away what I actually felt underneath it. "Did your niece happen to hear a name?" I asked, and I heard how careful my own voice had gone. How quiet. How deliberately unhurried. Something like Grady Odell said, "I don't know a last name. I only mention it because it seemed strange to me, given everything you've been through with them these past weeks. A man papers plans for a shop, and none of it involving your son at all as far as my niece could tell." I thanked Odell for the coat and for the trust it had clearly taken to hand something like that over to me. And after she left, I stood alone in that little storefront with the bell over the door, still swinging faintly. And I let the pieces settle into place slowly one at a time, the way you set pins into fabric before you commit to the cut before there's no taking it back. I closed the shop early that day, something I almost never did, and drove down to the water instead of going straight home, sitting in my car with the engine off watching the tide come in over the rocks, the way I'd watched it 100 times before without really seeing it. I thought about the woman who had stood on that same stretch of shoreline months earlier, freshly told her house had never belonged to anyone but her, believing the hardest part was already behind her. I thought about how wrong that woman had been, how the hardest parts of a story like this one rarely arrive all at once, how they come instead in smaller waves, each one requiring you to stand back up a little faster than the last. I sat there until the light went gold and then gray, and then I drove home and called Foster because sitting with a thing alone only helps for so long before it needs to become something you can actually act on, because it made a terrible kind of sense. The lawsuit wasn't only about the house, it was about capital. Somewhere in the last months, Marlene had been meeting a man who wasn't her husband, discussing plans of business, a shop papers spread across a table at a hotel out past the marina, and the money to fund whatever that was would have to come from somewhere real. Which meant the fight over Larkspur Court, the claim of a verbal agreement made years ago and never once written down. All of it might never have been about believing she had a genuine right to that house at all. It might only ever have been about needing money and finding the fastest lever available to pull, and I happened to be standing at the end of it. I called Foster that evening and told him what Odell had shared, and I heard him go quiet on the other end of the line, the way he did when he was turning something over carefully before speaking, weighing how much of it was usable and how much was simply suspicion dressed up as fact. "That's worth looking into," he said finally. "If we can establish that the claim isn't made in good faith, that it's being used as leverage for something entirely unrelated to any genuine belief about ownership, it strengthens our position considerably. Let me see what I can find through proper channels." It took him 4 days. 4 days I spent mostly at the sewing machine, hands busy, while my mind circled the same questions over and over because work had always been the one place I could go when the rest of my life refused to hold still, the one place where a problem had a clear beginning and a clear end, and didn't argue back. On the 5th day, Foster called and asked me to come by his office, and something in his voice told me I should sit down before he said whatever he'd found before he laid it out on the desk between us, the way he'd laid out the deed all those weeks before. "There's a business filing," he told me once I was seated across from him. "An LLC registered 3 weeks ago. a men's clothing boutique downtown storefront still in the early stages of getting off the ground. The listed managing member is a man named Grady Pruitt. I sat with that name a moment, turning it over, feeling how unfamiliar, and yet how suddenly important it had become in the span of a single sentence. And Marlene, I asked, is she listed anywhere on the paperwork itself? Not on the filing, Foster said. But I found something else. He turned his laptop toward me, and there on the screen was an email thread forwarded to his office through channels he didn't fully explain, and I didn't fully want to know, between Marlene and a business contact discussing startup funds for the venture. In it, in her own words, typed out plainly enough that there was no room left for interpretation or excuse, Marlene had written that once the house situation with Verna resolved one way or another, there would be capital available to move forward properly. I read it twice, because there it was, finally in her own hand, in language that admitted more than any accusation I could have made myself. Proof that the lawsuit, the claim of some long ago promised the attorney, all of it had never been rooted in any real belief that house was owed to her. It had only ever been a door she was trying to force open to get to the money sitting on the other side of it. There's more, Foster said gently, and something in the careful way he said it made my stomach drop before he'd even continued speaking. Further down the thread, Dwight is copied on an earlier version of this email chain, sent 6 weeks ago before any of this ever reached my office. I sat very still, which meant my son had known. Not everything, maybe. Not the full shape of it, not the hotel lunches or the papers spread across a table, but something. Enough to have seen his wife discussing capital and a business venture with another man weeks before any lawsuit was ever filed against me, and he had said nothing to me, not one word, not even a warning. Had sat across from me in that conference room asking how I could do this to my own son, while somewhere behind his own silence, something far more complicated than a fight over a house had already been quietly taking shape without my knowledge. I don't know how long I sat there in Foster's office without speaking. Long enough that he finally closed the laptop gently and folded his hands on the desk and waited, because he had known me 10 years and understood, I think, that some news needs a woman to arrive at her own reaction in her own time, on her own terms, without anyone rushing her toward the next sentence. He knew, I finally said. Foster, he knew, and he let me believe this was only ever about the house. I can't say what he knew or didn't know, not with certainty, Foster said carefully. Only that he was copied on the message. What he understood from it or chose not to understand, I couldn't tell you with any confidence. I drove home that evening with the windows down despite the cold coming off the water, because I needed the noise of the road to fill up the silence in my own head, the silence that kept trying to form itself into a shape I didn't want to look at directly yet. And somewhere on that drive, the grief I'd been holding at arm's length since the text message on the morning of the cruise finally caught up with me completely. Not for the house, not even for the money, but for the son. I thought I knew the boy who'd held my hand too tightly at his father's graveside. Now a man capable of sitting silently on a truth this large while I carried the full weight of being called a villain for defending myself in the meantime. He called 2 nights later before I decided what, if anything, I would say to him about what Foster had found. His voice was quieter than it had been in that conference room, worn down in a way that made him sound for a moment much younger than 40, closer to the boy who used to call me from a friend's house asking to be picked up early. Mom, he said, Marlene and I, we're separating. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence stretch the way I'd learned to let it stretch, because I no longer rushed to fill every quiet space with reassurance just to spare someone else's discomfort at my own expense. I know about Grady, I finally said. I know about the business. I know you were copied on that email 6 weeks ago, Dwight. The silence on his end went different, then heavier, and when he spoke again, his voice had cracked open at the edges in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, confessing something he knew would disappoint me. I didn't know what to do with it, he said. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself she wouldn't actually go through with anything. And then everything happened with the house, and it was easier to be angry at you than to look directly at what was actually falling apart in my own marriage the whole time. Why didn't you say anything to me? I asked, not accusing exactly, though I heard the old hurt still sitting underneath the question, regardless of how carefully I tried to keep it out. We used to tell each other things, Dwight. Before Marlene. I remember that. I know, he said, and I heard something catch in his throat before he continued. I think somewhere along the way I got scared that if I told you the truth about my own marriage falling apart, you'd think I'd failed at the one thing I was supposed to be better at, than you were building a family that actually held together, instead of one that needed to be held together by a woman doing everything alone. I didn't want to be one more person handing you something heavy to carry. Isn't that funny? I spent 30 years trying not to add weight to what you were carrying, and somehow still managed to let you carry the heaviest thing of all without even knowing it was there. I closed my eyes and pressed the phone tighter against my ear, and for the first time since that morning on the sofa, I felt something in me soften toward him. Not because what he'd done was right, but because I recognized painfully a version of my own instinct living inside his. The instinct to look away from the thing that frightens you most, and busy yourself instead with a fight you think you can actually win. "I want to fix this, Mom," he said. "Not the marriage. I don't know about that anymore, honestly. But us. You and me. I want to fix that part if you'll let me try." I told him it would take time. That trust, once it's been spent carelessly, doesn't refill itself just because someone finally says the right words out loud on a phone call at 10 at night. But I also told him, and I meant it, that I was willing to let the door stand open a crack if he was willing to walk through it slowly, honestly, without expecting me to meet him halfway before he'd even proven with his actions that he meant any of it. We agreed before we hung up that the lawsuit would be dropped, that Marlene, once she understood what Foster had found and what it would mean if it ever surfaced in front of a judge, would have very little choice but to withdraw her claim entirely rather than risk that email thread becoming part of the public record. And in its place, I told Dwight I wanted to set something up properly this time. Not a verbal promise, not a someday. A fund established through Foster's office set aside for Winnie alone, untouchable until she turned 18, meant only for her education, protected from anyone who might one day look at it and see, instead of a child's future, simply another door to force open when things got difficult. Dwight was quiet a moment. "That's generous, Mom," he said, "after everything that's happened." "It isn't generosity," I told him. "It's love with the doors locked properly this time. There's a difference, and I've only just learned it myself later in life than I would have liked." Faye called the following week, her voice different than it had been that first difficult afternoon. Softer around the edges, and she told me Dwight had called her too, had told her about the separation and the emails and the fund, and that she was sorry plainly without excuses attached to the apology. The way people sometimes attach them to make the apology cost them less. "I judged you before I understood what you were actually standing inside of," she said. "I'm sorry for that, Verna. I should have asked more questions before I decided I already knew the answer." I told her it was all right, and I meant it more than I expected to, because some part of me had missed my sister more than I'd let myself admit those past weeks, and because forgiving Faye cost me so much less than forgiving anyone else in this story had, which made it strangely the easiest gift I gave that whole difficult year. After I hung up, I sat alone on my balcony a long while, the ocean going dark in front of me, the shoebox of Walter's letters resting on the table beside my tea, though I didn't open it that particular night. I didn't need to. I already knew somewhere underneath all of it exactly what he would have said. That the hardest kind of forgiveness isn't the kind you offer freely without thought the way I used to hand out everything I had. It's the kind you offer carefully with your eyes wide open, knowing exactly what you're choosing to risk and choosing anyway, because the alternative, becoming a woman who trusted no one ever again, was never really who I wanted to become, not even after everything. Faye drove down the following month unannounced, except for a text that morning saying she was already halfway there, and I opened my door to find her standing on the mat with a casserole dish balanced on one hip and an overnight bag on her shoulder, the way she used to show up at my house decades earlier whenever she decided I needed looking after, whether I'd asked for it or not. We spent the weekend the way sisters do when they're trying to make up for lost years without saying so, directly rearranging the furniture in my small living room until it finally made sense, walking the beach in the mornings before the tourists arrived, staying up too late at my kitchen table going through old photographs neither of us had looked at in years. She found one near the bottom of a box I'd never fully unpacked of the two of us as girls sharing that same bedroom she'd mentioned on the phone, arguing our mother had written on the back in pencil over whose turn it was for the good pillow. We laughed until we cried over that photograph, and then we cried for a while without laughing, and by the time she left on Sunday evening, something between us had settled into a shape it hadn't held in longer than either of us wanted to admit, closer to what sisters are supposed to be than what we had allowed ourselves to become somewhere in the busy middle of our separate lives. The months that followed settled into something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. A rhythm. Not peace exactly, because peace still felt like a word I was cautious around, the way you're cautious stepping onto ice. You've been told is thick enough to hold you, but haven't tested with your own weight yet. Still something steadier than what had come before. Saturday mornings became ours again, mine and Dwight's coffee on my balcony, while Winnie built elaborate kingdoms out of sand below us on the beach, and some part of me that had gone quiet for years started slowly to hum back to life the way a shop does when you finally unlock it after a long closure and let the light back in through the front window. Dwight had moved into a small apartment near his work sparse, still half unpacked the last time I visited, boxes stacked against a wall he clearly hadn't decided what to do with, yet the way a man doesn't fully unpack when some part of him is still waiting to see if the ground under this new life is going to hold. He came to me most weekends, sometimes with Winnie, sometimes alone, and we talked in a way we never had before, not as mother managing son, not as son, avoiding conflict at any cost, but as two people slowly relearning how to be honest with each other after years of practicing everything except that particular skill. He told me about his father one afternoon, about how he still remembered the exact sound of Walter's truck pulling into the driveway each evening before dinner, and how after he died I had gone so quiet with grief that he'd learned very young not to ask me for anything that might add weight to what I was already visibly carrying. I hadn't known that. 34 years, and I hadn't known my own son had spent his childhood quietly protecting me, instead of the other way around, the way it was always supposed to go. "I used to leave your lunch money on the counter instead of handing it to you," he said, staring out at the water instead of at me, "because you'd get this look sometimes right after Dad died, like handing you one more thing to remember was going to be the thing that finally broke you in half. So I learned to just take it myself. I learned to need less out loud so you wouldn't have less to carry." I think some part of me never stopped doing that, actually. I think that's part of how Marlene got so much room to push you out without me pushing back. I'd already spent my whole childhood not asking my mother for things. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot how to ask anyone for anything, including myself. I sat with that a long moment, watching Winnie dig further into her fortress below us, unaware that two grown adults above her were quietly rearranging 30 years of misunderstanding into something they could finally see clearly. "I'm sorry," I told him. "I'm sorry I was that quiet for that long. And I'm sorry you had to learn to be small so I wouldn't have to feel how big my own grief was. That wasn't fair to you, even if I never meant it to happen that way." He shook his head slowly. "You were doing the best you could with what you had left, Mom. I'm not angry about it. I just wanted you to know I saw it even back then. I saw all of it. I just didn't have the words yet for what I was seeing." It was several months after that particular conversation, well into the following spring, when Dwight mentioned almost sideways that he'd started seeing someone, a woman he'd met through a coworker, careful to tell me before it became anything worth calling. Serious the way he never would have thought to do in the years I'd spent learning secondhand about the milestones of his marriage. Her name was Odessa, he said, watching my face carefully for a reaction. A nurse who worked nights at the hospital 2 towns over and he liked. He told me that she asked him direct questions and expected direct answers, that she'd already told him plainly she wasn't interested in being anybody's rebound or anybody's rescue. I told him that sounded like exactly the kind of woman worth being honest with from the very beginning, and I meant it. And I watched something in his shoulders relax that I don't think had fully relaxed since the whole ordeal began. "Take it slow," I told him, not because I doubted him, but because I finally understood at 66 that slow wasn't the same thing as scared that a person could take their time choosing who to trust without it meaning they'd learn nothing at all from being burned. It was on one of those Saturdays, coffee going cold in my hands while Winnie dug a moat around her latest fortress below, that I met Hollis Pemberton. He lived 2 floors below me, a widower retired from something in shipping insurance he described so blandly the first time I asked that I suspected he found the whole subject nearly as dull as I did, and said so, which made me laugh out loud for what felt like the first time in months. We met in the elevator first, a brief exchange about the weather, nothing more than 2 neighbors being polite. Then again at the little market 3 blocks from the building, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee on the same shelf, and he'd laughed easy and unhurried and said something about how a person could tell a great deal about someone by which brand of coffee they refused to compromise on, no matter the price difference. I hadn't expected to feel anything at all in that moment, standing in a narrow grocery aisle with a canister of coffee in my hand. I want to say that honestly. I had built a life by 66 around not expecting things for myself, around being the person who handled things for everyone else, and quietly went without, so there would be enough left over for whoever needed it more. But there was something in the way Hollis asked a few days later whether I might want to have that coffee together, instead of separately standing in our own kitchens on opposite sides of a wall that cracked something open in me I hadn't realized was still capable of cracking after everything else that had already broken that year. We had coffee. Then we had it again the following week and the week after that, until it became simply a thing we did, unremarked upon the way old habits form without anyone deciding on them formally. Nothing dramatic, nothing that belonged in the kind of story where a woman's whole life turns on a single romance discovered late. Just an easy hour twice a week, where nobody needed anything from me except my company, and I found myself looking forward to it in a way that felt almost embarrassing at first, until I let myself stop being embarrassed and simply enjoy it instead, the way I hadn't let myself enjoy much of anything purely for its own sake, in longer than I could accurately count. Because that was new too. Enjoying something without immediately searching it for the eventual cost, without waiting for the bill to come due the way it always seemed to with everyone else. I started going back to the Tuesday evening quilting circle that met in the basement of the church 3 streets over. Something I'd let lapse for the better part of a decade, because there was always a client's hem or a son's crisis that seemed more urgent at the time. The women there had known me for years, some of them clients, some of them simply neighbors who'd watched Dwight grow up alongside their own children. And when I walked back in that first Tuesday, a little unsure of my welcome after such a long absence, Odell herself looked up from her square of fabric and said, "Well, it's about time, Verna Ostrander," and scooted her chair over to make room like no time at all had passed. We didn't talk about the house or the lawsuit or any of it, not directly, not that first night. We talked about fabric and grandchildren and a recipe for lemon bars. Somebody's daughter had ruined twice trying to follow off the internet, and I sat there with a needle in my hand among women who had watched entire lifetimes unfold in that basement, and I felt something in my shoulders loosen that I hadn't realized had been clenched for months. It struck me driving home that night how much of my healing that whole difficult year had come not from any single dramatic moment in a courtroom or a conference room, but from small, ordinary rooms like that one women stitching quietly together, asking nothing of each other except company and the occasional honest opinion about whether a border should be sashed in blue or green. He asked me to dinner properly a few weeks in a small seafood place a few blocks up the coast road with paper placemats and a view of the pier, nothing that required either of us to dress beyond ourselves. He told me about his wife that night, gently the way a person tells you about someone they loved well, and lost slowly, rather than all at once, a long illness that had taken the better part of 3 years to finish its work. I told him about Walter the mower still running against the fence line, the shock of a Tuesday afternoon that never gave any warning at all. We sat with that a while, 2 people who understood a particular kind of loss without needing it, explained further, and at some point he reached across the table and asked plainly whether I thought 2 people our age were allowed to want something new, instead of simply managing what was left of the old. I told him I didn't know the rule on that. I told him I'd spent so many years managing what was left for other people that I'd nearly forgotten wanting was a thing I was still permitted to do on my own account. He said, "Well, then maybe we find out together," and I laughed, surprised at how easy it was, how little it cost me to say yes to something that asked for nothing back except my company. I didn't know sitting on that balcony those Saturday mornings watching Winnie dig moats into wet sand while Dwight supervised with his pant legs rolled up to his knees that the ground under all of it was already shifting, somewhere out of sight the way ground does before you feel the first tremor. It started with something small. Dwight mentioned almost in passing over coffee one Saturday that Marlene had lost her position at the marketing firm 2 months earlier. She'd kept it from everyone, he said, even from Maxine, at first too proud or too frightened to say the words out loud to her own mother. Money had gotten tight, tighter than tight from what he could gather secondhand. And though I felt a flicker of something almost like sympathy, because I understood better than most what it meant to carry financial fear silently rather than admit it to the people who might actually help, that flicker didn't stay soft in my chest for long. The call from Foster came on a gray Tuesday, rain threatening but not yet arriving. Marlene wanted a meeting, he told me, regarding the education fund we'd set up for Winnie. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it. In my kitchen dish towel still in my hand from drying the breakfast dishes, and something in my chest went tight and cold all at once, because that fund had been the one clean thing to survive the entire mess of the previous year, untouchable until Winnie turned 18. That had been the whole point of building it the way we had. "She's requesting an early release," Foster said. 30% of it to enroll Winnie in a private academy for next year. She's framing it as being entirely in Winnie's best interest, nothing to do with anything else going on in her life. I stood there a long moment, dish towel forgotten in my hand, and I felt something old and tired rise up in me, the exact shape of every request that had ever arrived at my door dressed up as being for someone else's good when it wasn't not underneath. "Set the meeting," I told Foster, "but I want to see the school myself first, before I decide anything at all." I drove out the following week to Winnie's current school, the public elementary 2 miles from Dwight's apartment, and I walked its halls slowly the way I imagined a woman might walk through a house she was seriously considering buying, noticing every detail with more attention than usual. Bright hallways lined with children's artwork. A teacher kneeling to talk eye level with a crying child in the corridor, patient entirely unhurried despite whatever else she surely had waiting for her that day. I found Winnie's classroom window and stood outside it a moment, watching her sit cross-legged in a reading circle, laughing at something a classmate had said entirely herself, entirely at home in that room full of other children's laughter. There was nothing wrong with that school. Nothing that $30,000 a year and a fancier building with a more impressive name would meaningfully improve for a girl who was already thriving exactly where she was. I understood standing there at that window exactly what this request actually was underneath its careful framing. I stayed longer than I'd planned, watching the reading circle break apart into smaller groups for what the teacher called center time watching. Winnie chose the art corner without hesitation, already reaching for a jar of buttons and scraps of felt. The way I reached for pins and threads, some instinct in her hands that I like to think had traveled down through whatever passes between a grandmother and a granddaughter, even when nobody's teaching it directly. A little boy beside her knocked over a cup of glue, and instead of complaining the way I half expected a 5-year-old to, Winnie simply handed him a paper towel from the roll on the table and kept working unbothered, the kind of small, unremarkable kindness that tells you more about a child's character than any test score ever could. I thought watching her that whatever else this family had gotten wrong across all those difficult months we had at least managed between us, to raise a girl who reached for a paper towel before she reached for blame, and that struck me as worth more than any private academy's polished brochure could ever promise. The coordinator walked with me a few minutes afterward, an unhurried woman with chalk dust still faintly visible on one sleeve, and when I asked plainly whether she thought a change of schools would benefit a child like Winnie, she considered the question with more care than I expected a stranger to give it. Children thrive on stability more than they thrive on prestige, she said. I've watched plenty of families chase a fancier building only to watch their child struggle to rebuild friendships and routines they'd already built once successfully. If Winnie is happy here, and she is, I'd think hard before disrupting that for reasons that have more to do with the adults than the child. I thanked her, and I drove home with that sentence sitting steadily in my chest, more useful to me than any legal argument Foster could have prepared, because it had come from someone with nothing at stake in our family's particular war, except the plain well-being of the children in her care. The mediation was held in a small conference room 2 floors below Foster's office, neutral ground on a paper, though nothing about the air in that room felt neutral once Marlene walked in and took her seat. She looked thinner than I remembered from the courthouse hallway all those months earlier. Sharper somewhere around the eyes, the way people get when worry has become a permanent resident rather than a passing visitor. She sat across from me with her own attorney beside her and got straight to it. No warmth, no pretense of softness first, no acknowledgement of anything that had passed between us before. Her attorney opened with a folder of statistics about private education outcomes, graduation rates and average earnings and college acceptance percentages, laid out with the kind of confident precision that made me understand watching him that he'd built this same argument for other families before and simply swapped in new names each time. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes before Foster interrupted gently but firmly to point out that none of those statistics accounted for a child already thriving in her current environment, that the numbers he was quoting measured averages across children starting from very different places than Winnie already occupied. The attorney recovered smoothly enough, pivoting to the argument about parental authority instead. But I noticed something in Marlene's face during that exchange. A flicker of something almost like embarrassment, as though even she understood the statistics had been more performance than substance. Winnie's education can't wait until she's 18, she said when it finally came her turn to speak. I'm her mother. I know what's best for her better than anyone else sitting at this table. The fund was created for her college. I told her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, given how my pulse was moving underneath it. Her school now is an excellent one. I walked its halls myself last week and saw exactly what she has there. You would say that Marlene said something brittle, cracking through her composure for just a moment. You've always needed to be the one who decides everything. Always needed to be the one holding all the strings, no matter who else is standing in the room. I felt Dwight shift beside me, uncomfortable, caught between 2 women who had never once, not for a single year of his marriage, managed to see each other clearly enough to find common ground. Marlene, he started, please, we're not here to fight each other in front of a mediator. She turned on him instead sharp, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see where this would go. Easy for you to say. You still get to see her every week without asking anyone's permission for anything, without having to justify a single decision to a courtroom full of strangers. Her attorney tried near the end to propose a middle path, a smaller percentage, a public magnet school instead of the private academy, something that might let both sides leave the table with a piece of what they'd come for. I considered it honestly for a moment longer than I expected to. But then I looked at Marlene's face while her attorney spoke, watched her jaw set the way it used to set right before she said something sharp enough to leave a mark, and I understood that this wasn't really about magnet schools or percentages at all. It was about whether she could still make me move simply by wanting something badly enough and saying so forcefully enough in a room with witnesses. I had spent 34 years being moved that way. I was not willing to spend one more year being moved that way over my own granddaughter's future. The fund stays as written, I told her attorney. Not because I don't want Winnie to have good things, because I already gave her the best thing I had to give, and it has an end date attached to protect her from exactly this conversation happening again in 5 years over something else. The mediation ended without agreement, exactly as I'd feared it might from the moment she sat down. I remember walking out to my car afterward feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from losing an argument, but from watching someone you once tried genuinely to love dig themselves in deeper, refusing every hand held out toward a softer landing that might have still been available to her. It was Winnie who carried the true weight of it, in the end the way children always do, no matter how carefully the adults around them think they're managing to shield them from what's really happening. She came to me one Sunday afternoon during a puzzle sorting through pieces of a castle scene spread across my coffee table, and asked without looking up from the pieces in her hands whether Grandma and Mommy were fighting because of her. I set my own puzzle piece down carefully. No, sweetheart, I told her. Never think that, not for one single second. Grown-ups sometimes disagree about grown-up things that have nothing to do with you at all. It is never ever because of you, and I need you to hear that clearly. But I heard Mommy on the phone, she said, still not looking up, her small fingers turning a puzzle piece over and over, saying you don't want me to go to a good school. I felt something crack quietly down the center of my chest, because how do you explain to a 5-year-old that the disagreement was never really about her school at all, not underneath it? That it was about a woman drowning in her own choices, reaching for the nearest rope, regardless of what it happened to be tied to, or who might get pulled under, trying to hold on to the other end of it. Your school is a very good school, I told her gently, choosing each word the way I used to choose fabric for how it would hold up over time. And when you're older, there's money already saved just for you, so you can go wherever you want to go when that day comes. This isn't about whether you deserve good things, Winnie. You already have them right now exactly as you are. She nodded slowly, the way children do when they've decided to trust an answer, even without fully understanding every part of it, and went back to fitting a piece of blue sky into place at the edge of her puzzle content, at least for that afternoon, to let the adults carry whatever they were carrying somewhere she couldn't see it. The forgery came to light 9 days before the court date that followed, when the mediation's failure pushed everything back into the formal system neither of us had wanted to return to. Foster called that morning with a tightness in his voice. I hadn't heard from him before, not even during the worst of the house dispute months earlier. There's something you need to see, he said. In person, not over the phone. Today, if you can come by. He laid the document on his desk when I arrived, waiting until I'd sat down before sliding it across to me. A withdrawal request submitted to the fund's managing bank requesting immediate release of $40,000. My signature at the bottom or something meant to pass for it. Except I had never signed it. I had never seen this particular piece of paper in my life. I sat very still, staring at a version of my own handwriting close enough to fool a stranger glancing at it quickly, but wrong in every small way. A person who has signed their own name for 66 years would recognize instantly the way you'd recognize a stranger wearing your own coat. The loop on the V too tight, too controlled. The final R rushed in a way I never rushed it, not once in 6 decades of writing my own name, which meant someone had traced it carefully from another document with my real signature on it, or copied it freehand close enough to almost pass, which meant this had gone past desperation and into something with a name I didn't want to say out loud in that office, not yet, not until I'd let it settle first. The bank flagged it before releasing anything Foster said. Their fraud department caught an inconsistency in the request and held it for review before any funds moved. I've already begun the process of reporting it formally on your behalf and the funds. What happens to her now, I asked, because even then, even looking at my own forged name on a document meant to take money set aside for a 5-year-old. Some part of me was still asking after Marlene's future, instead of only my own protection. Foster folded his hands on the desk. That depends on how the district attorney's office chooses to proceed, he said. It could be treated seriously. It could also be resolved without formal charges if restitution and cooperation come quickly enough. I want you prepared for either outcome, Verna, because I don't think you're the kind of woman who wants to spend the next year of her life watching her son's wife go through the criminal system if there's another way to protect Winnie just as well. I want to describe what I felt in that moment honestly, because it wasn't rage. Not at first, not the way I might have expected. It was a kind of grief so specific it had almost a shape to it, a weight I could have located precisely in my chest if someone had asked me to point to it. Grief for a woman I had once briefly hoped might soften into something better over time now, instead willing to forge my own name on a legal document, rather than simply ask me plainly in her own voice for the help she actually needed. The courtroom 9 days later felt smaller than I expected it to, fluorescent light flattening every face in it into something tired and plain stripped of whatever dignity people usually carry into a room on purpose. Marlene sat across the aisle in a gray suit composed on the surface, though I noticed her hands stayed folded too tightly in her lap, the entire proceeding white at the knuckles if you looked closely enough. Dwight sat beside me, quiet, steady, a version of himself I was still learning to trust completely, but trusting a little more with each week that passed without him disappointing me. Foster laid it out plainly for the judge, methodical, unhurried, the way he did everything that mattered. The fund's original terms, both parents' signatures at its creation, dated and witnessed. The quality of Winnie's current school, documented, photographed, unnecessary to dispute, given the evidence in front of everyone. And quietly, without theater, without raising his voice even slightly, the forged withdrawal request, the bank's own fraud flag, the signature analysis Foster had commissioned that confirmed what I already knew in my body the moment I'd first seen it laid across his desk. Marlene's attorney made one final attempt before the judge began her ruling, arguing that a mother's judgment about her own child's education deserved deference. The court wasn't giving it that the fund's rigid terms punished a family for circumstances that had changed since it was written. The judge listened to all of it without expression, the way I imagined she had listened to 1,000 versions of the same argument, dressed up in 1,000 different outfits over the years on that bench. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no particular warmth and no particular coldness either, only the flat certainty of someone reading facts rather than delivering a verdict aimed at anyone in the room personally. The judge did not take long to decide, reading through the exhibits with the flat efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this particular story before and knew exactly what weight to give each piece of it. The fund would remain exactly as established, untouched until Winnie turned 18, not $1 released early for any reason short of a genuine medical emergency. Her current school would remain her school, any future change requiring both parents' documented agreement in writing, not one parent's unilateral decision made under financial pressure. And given the evidence presented regarding the forged document, the court noted its serious concern and would be referring the matter for further review outside these proceedings. I did not feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom. I want to say that clearly because some part of me still believed winning was supposed to feel like something solid and satisfying settling into your chest once the gavel came down in your favor. Instead, I felt Dwight's hand find mine in the hallway outside, quiet, steady, and I felt something closer to sorrow than victory. Sorrow that a family could arrive at a place where a judge's ruling was required to settle what should have only ever needed honesty between the people involved freely given years earlier. Foster called 2 weeks after that, once the district attorney's office had finished its own review of the forged withdrawal request. They'd decided in the end not to pursue formal charges, largely because Marlene had come forward voluntarily to the investigator handling the referral, admitted what she'd done without making me sit through a trial to prove it, and agreed to a restitution arrangement that included a formal admission on record should anything similar ever happen again. I want to be honest that some small hard part of me had wanted the harder outcome, wanted her to feel the particular weight of consequence, the way I had felt the weight of 34 years going unnoticed. But Foster reminded me gently that the goal had never been punishment for its own sake, only protection for Winnie's future, and that protection had already been secured the moment the fund held firm in court. I told him he was right. I mostly believed it too, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, though grief and relief kept trading places in my chest for the rest of that particular afternoon, unable to settle on which one belonged there more. "Thank you for standing firm, Mom," Dwight said quietly as we walked toward the parking lot together, the afternoon sun doing nothing to lighten the weight either of us was carrying out of that building. I looked at him a long moment before answering. "I didn't do it to win against her, Dwight," I said. "I did it because Winnie deserves people around her who protect her, not people who use her as a way to get to something else they want." He nodded and neither of us said anything else the rest of the walk, and I remember looking back once toward the courthouse steps where Marlene stood alone, her attorney already walking away from her toward his own car without a backward glance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, despite the warm afternoon sun beating down on the concrete. Something in the stillness of her and the particular way she stared out at nothing at all settled uneasily in my stomach the entire drive home, though I couldn't yet have told you exactly why, only that it felt like watching someone standing very close to an edge she hadn't fully registered yet herself. The uneasy feeling I carried home from the courthouse that day didn't fade the way most uneasy feelings eventually do. Once enough ordinary days pile up on top of them. It sat in me for weeks, low and persistent, the way a splinter sits under skin long after you've stopped consciously feeling it until something presses the wrong way, and you remember all at once that it's still there at all buried and waiting. Visitation continued through the early spring supervised at first, then gradually less so as the court eased its restrictions in small measured steps, the way these things tend to unwind once enough time passes without incident. Marlene came to collect Winnie on schedule polite in the clipped way of someone performing politeness, rather than actually feeling it underneath. And I told myself each time I watched her pull away from the curb that this was simply what the other side of a hard-won peace looked like from the outside. Civil, a little cold, survivable if nothing else. Maxine came to my door on a rainy Thursday afternoon, her umbrella dripping onto my welcome mat, her face carrying an expression I hadn't seen on her before in all the months I'd known her. Not worry exactly. Something further along than worry, something closer to dread that had already made up its mind about what it was looking at. "May I come in, Verna?" she asked. "We need to talk about something." I made tea because my hands needed something to do while my mind braced itself for whatever was coming. We sat across from each other in my small living room, rain tapping steadily against the window glass, and Maxine wrapped both hands around her cup like she needed the warmth of it just to get the words out of her mouth at all. "Marlene is different lately," she said, catching herself before she used the old name. I never actually gave her daughter an old habit. I'd noticed she sometimes slipped into and always corrected on her own. "She's talking about starting over somewhere else entirely. A new city. A new job, though she hasn't said where or doing what. And she said small things about not needing anyone's permission for anything anymore. Not the courts, not yours, not even Dwight's, as if none of it applies to her the way it applies to everyone else." I felt something cold settle into my chest, spreading slowly the way cold water does when you step into it too fast. "Has she said anything about Winnie specifically?" I asked. Maxine's eyes dropped to her tea, unable to hold my gaze while she said the rest of it. "She said Winnie deserves a mother who isn't controlled by everyone else's rules," she said quietly. I didn't like the way she said it, Verna. I didn't like it at all, not the words themselves, so much as the certainty underneath them. I sat with that a long moment, the rain filling the silence between us, and I thought of Odell Ferris standing in my little shop months earlier with a coat over her arm, telling me about a lunch at a hotel out past the Marina papers spread across a table a man named Grady. "Has she mentioned Grady Pruitt recently?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Maxine's face changed just slightly, confirming something before her words even caught up to it. "He's been calling again," she said. "I've heard her on the phone with him more than once these last few weeks. Low voice, door closed. The kind of calls you don't want your own mother overhearing, no matter how thin the walls are. I called Foster that same evening, and I heard in the particular stillness that followed my explanation of everything Maxine had shared that he was taking it exactly as seriously as I needed him to. No hesitation, no need to convince him further. "I'll request an emergency review of the custody terms," he told me. Given the pattern, given what her own mother is reporting to us directly, a judge may be willing to add restrictions before anything happens, rather than waiting for something to happen first, and trying to undo it afterward. The review was scheduled faster than I expected within the week. A brief hearing in a courthouse annex that felt nothing like the formal courtroom from months before, just a cramped office with a judge behind a desk instead of a bench reading through Foster's filing with the particular efficiency of someone who saw a dozen versions of Family Crisis before lunch most days. Marlene's own attorney argued there was nothing concrete to act on, only a mother's second-hand worry and an old business acquaintance's phone calls, hardly grounds for restricting a parent's rights further than they'd already been restricted. The judge listened unmoved and ultimately split the difference in a way that satisfied no one, fully ordering Winnie's passport held by the court clerk's office and requiring 48 hours written notice before any overnight travel outside the county, but declining to expand the supervision requirements any further without something more concrete than a mother's unease to point to. Foster called it a partial win on the drive home, and I remember thinking sitting in my kitchen afterward that a partial win was still only half a fence around, something that mattered as much as Winnie did, and that half a fence had never once in the whole of my life been enough to keep out anything determined to get through it. Before anything happens. I turned that phrase over for days afterward because I wanted so badly to believe we were still standing safely on that particular side of it that there was still time enough to act before the ground gave way entirely. We weren't, there wasn't. The call came on a Tuesday morning early enough that the light outside my kitchen window was still thin and gray, barely committed yet to becoming daylight. Maxine's voice when I answered didn't sound like her own voice at all, stripped down to something raw and frightened underneath it. "Verna," she said. "Marlene didn't bring Winnie to school this morning. She never showed up at all. I called the house, I called her cell. Everything goes straight to voicemail without even ringing first. Dwight's already gone to the police station. I don't remember getting my keys. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, and then somehow being in my car already driving faster than I should have through streets still mostly empty at that hour. My hands so tight on the wheel, my knuckles ached by the time I reached the station and threw the car into park. Dwight was already inside standing at the front desk, his face the color of old paper left too long in the sun. An officer was writing something down as he spoke, and I caught fragments of it walking in through the glass doors. Left no note. Phone off since sometime last night. Wasn't answering texts since yesterday afternoon, according to the last message he'd sent her. The officer looked up when I approached, took my information carefully, explained in a voice trained for exactly this kind of moment that an alert had already been issued moving through the proper channels as we stood there, because a court order existed dated and on file, because the custody terms had been formally documented just weeks before thanks to Foster's emergency filing that suddenly felt less like caution and more like foresight, because all of that together meant the system could move quickly instead of treating this as some ordinary domestic disagreement that would sort itself out by dinner time. Neighboring counties have been notified, the officer said, matter-of-fact, methodical. Transit stations, airports. We'll need a recent photograph of the child if you happen to have one with you. I had one in my wallet, worn soft at the corners from being carried and looked at too many times. Winnie mid-laugh on the beach outside my building, sand on her knees, sun in her hair. I handed it over with fingers that had gone strangely numb, and I watched a stranger photograph my granddaughter's face for a file that existed only because someone I had once briefly hoped might become real family to me had decided the rules no longer applied to her at all. Dwight and I didn't go back to his apartment that day. We went to mine instead because neither of us could stand the idea of sitting alone with this particular fear, and Maxine came too. The three of us gathered in my small living room like survivors of something none of us had proper names for, yet something too large and too new to fit into ordinary language. Maxine made tea, nobody drank. I set out food, nobody touched plates going cold on the counter, untouched. We sat with our phones face up on the coffee table between us, waiting for them to ring, flinching every single time one of them so much as buzzed with something entirely irrelevant. A spam call, a weather alert, anything but the call we were actually waiting for. It was Dwight who remembered Grady's last name first, though of course we already knew it by then from Foster's earlier investigation, and it was Maxine who remembered with a small broken sound catching in her throat that Grady had moved south some years back near the coastline that stretched down toward the border further than any of us wanted to imagine a 5-year-old being taken. I called Foster the moment Dwight said it out loud, and Foster called the detective assigned to the case within minutes, and within an hour, the search had a direction, instead of just an expanding, useless radius with nothing at its center, which meant it was real now in a way it hadn't quite been in the first frantic hour. Not a scare that would resolve itself with an apologetic phone call by dinner time. Real in the way that made the whole evening stretch out long and strange, every sound in the building suddenly enormous. Every car passing outside sending my heart into my throat before I could stop the reaction from happening. I remember trying to keep my hands busy the way I always had, going into the small sewing kit I kept even in that apartment and threading a needle just to have something between my fingers, and I remember setting it down again almost immediately because my hands wouldn't hold still long enough to guide it through the fabric. Dwight paced the length of my living room over and over the same 6 steps to the window and back, until Maxine finally stood and put both hands on his shoulders and told him to sit gently, the way you'd talk a spooked animal down from a ledge. I found myself more than once that evening reaching for my phone to call Winnie's own small number, the one Dwight had set up for her tablet so she could leave me voice messages, before remembering there was no one on the other end of it to answer not tonight, and each time I remembered it felt like losing her all over again in miniature. At some point past 9, Dwight asked out of nowhere whether I remembered the year he'd wandered off at the county fair, no older than 4, and how long it had taken to find him, standing perfectly calm beside the livestock pens, petting a goat, like nothing in the world was wrong, while half the fairground searched in a panic. I did remember. I remembered it with a clarity that frightened me a little, considering how many other memories from that stretch of years had gone soft and vague with time. He said he'd been thinking about it all evening, how strange it was that the worst 20 minutes of his life up to that point had ended with a goat and an ice cream cone, and how he couldn't make himself believe this one would end anywhere near that gently. I didn't have anything comforting enough to offer him in return, so I only reached over and took his hand the way I hadn't done since he was small enough to need it crossing a street, and we sat like that a long while, neither of us pretending the other one wasn't afraid. Because I had not let myself imagine, not once in the months of lawsuits and forged signatures and courtroom silences that had already worn me down more than I wanted to admit that it would ever come to this, that the fight over a house, over a fund, over whether a child deserved private school tuition, would end with all of us sitting in my living room past midnight watching a phone that refused for hour after unbearable hour to ring. Until it finally did just after 11 that night, cutting through the silence so sharply that all 3 of us flinched at once, and I watched Dwight's whole body go rigid before he'd even managed to say hello into it. It was Maxine's letter that broke something open before the police did, arriving in a different form entirely. She found it in Marlene's old room at her house, tucked inside a drawer she'd gone into looking for anything that might help, and she brought it to us with shaking hands the moment she found it unable to bear sitting on it even a single hour longer than necessary. "Mom, it read, by the time you find this, will already be somewhere new. I can't keep watching Winnie grow up under everyone else's rules. Under Verna's money and Verna's fund and Verna's lawyer deciding what's best for my own daughter every single time. I'm taking her somewhere we can start over, just the 2 of us. Please don't try to find us. This isn't goodbye. Just a pause. I'll reach out when things settle down." Dwight read it twice, his hands trembling visibly by the second pass through the words, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet with something that had gone past ordinary sadness into pure fury underneath it. "She's calling it a pause," he said, his voice cracking hard on the word. "Like taking our daughter across state lines without telling anyone is something you can call a pause." I said nothing because there was nothing steady enough in me yet to say out loud without my own voice breaking too. I only reached over and took the letter gently from his hands so he wouldn't have to keep holding it, keep staring at those particular words as though staring might somehow change what they said. Maxine sat down heavily on my sofa, her face gray in a way I hadn't seen on her before, not even the day she'd first come to warn me about Grady's calls. "This is my fault," she said quietly, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I raised her. I should have seen more of this coming years ago, should have said something sooner, instead of hoping it would sort itself out on its own." I sat beside her and took one of her hands, still the way I might have taken a client's hand across a counter after delivering bad news about a garment that couldn't be saved. "You didn't raise her to do this, Maxine," I said. "You raised her the best you knew how, same as I raised Dwight the best I knew how, and grown children still find their own way into their own mistakes, no matter how carefully we tried to keep them from it. We're not on trial here tonight. Only Winnie matters right now. Only bringing her home." Maxine nodded, and something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, enough to let her breathe a little easier while we waited together for the phone to finally ring. The detective called Dwight directly, just before midnight, the ringtone cutting through the room like something physical. I watched my son's face while he listened, watched the fear on it shift slowly, unbearably slowly into something closer to relief with every passing second, and I found myself gripping the arm of my chair so hard my own fingers ached from the pressure. "They're safe," he finally said, the phone still pressed hard against his ear, his voice cracking open with something that was almost too large to be called relief. "Mom, Maxine, they found them. A motel near the coast, close to the border crossing. Winnie's safe. She's completely entirely safe." I don't remember standing up. I only remember somehow being across the room with my arms around my son, both of us shaking hard enough that neither of us could have said which one of us started it. Maxine's hand pressed hard against her own mouth behind us, the three of us bound together in that moment by a fear that had finally mercifully been allowed to end, after what felt like an entire lifetime, compressed into a single night. The days after that moved in a strange fog, part exhaustion, part disbelief, that something so frightening could resolve itself and simply become the past tense so quickly, so completely once the worst of it had passed. Marlene was held briefly for questioning at the local station near where they'd been found, then released under conditions that stripped away nearly everything she'd fought so hard for in that courtroom months earlier. Supervised visitation only, and even that contingent on completing a court-mandated program, the kind meant for parents who had shown through their own choices, and not through any accusation that trust had to be rebuilt from somewhere very close to zero, brick by careful brick. I saw Winnie 3 days after they found her, and I want to describe what that reunion looked like, honestly, without softening it into something prettier than it actually was in the moment. She looked smaller than I remembered, even though it had only been days since I'd last held her quieter, her eyes darting toward doorways in a way 5-year-olds shouldn't have had any reason to learn. But when she saw me, she ran anyway, the same run she'd always had since she was barely steady on her feet, and she buried her face against my neck and stayed there a long time without saying a single word at all, just breathing, just holding on. "Mommy said we were going somewhere new," she finally whispered against my shoulder, her small voice muffled against my collar. "But I didn't want to go without saying bye to you and Daddy first." I held her tighter and told her the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud in that moment. "Grown-ups make mistakes sometimes, sweetheart, even when they think they're doing something right in their own hearts. What matters is you're safe now, and you are so loved. By all of us, every single one without a single exception." She stayed close to me the rest of that first afternoon, not wanting to be set down even to eat, and at one point watching cartoons with her head heavy against my shoulder. She asked quietly whether she'd done something wrong to make Mommy want to drive away like that. I felt my whole chest tighten at the question at how easily children reach for their own blame when the adults around them have failed to explain themselves clearly enough. "No, sweetheart," I told her, turning her gently so she could see my face while I said it. "You didn't do one single thing wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get scared or confused, and they make choices that hurt the people they love most, even though they never meant to. That's on the grown-up. That's never ever on the child." She considered this with the particular seriousness only a 5-year-old can bring to a sentence, and then nodded and pressed her face back into my shoulder, and I held her there until she finally mercifully fell asleep. The months that followed rebuilt themselves slowly, the way most real healing does without dramatic turning points to mark the calendar, just small ordinary days stacked carefully on top of each other until they became something solid enough to actually stand on again without fear of it giving way. Winnie moved in mostly with Dwight in a bigger apartment near his work with a proper room of her own this time, and I picked her up from school 3 afternoons a week, and Marlene, once her therapy program was fully underway, began showing up to supervised visits with less anger, visible in her shoulders each time slowly relearning. I think what it actually meant to want her daughter's love honestly, instead of simply demanding it as though it were owed to her without effort. On the afternoons I picked her up, Winnie took to sitting on a low stool beside my machine at the shop while I worked her own small hoop and a spool of thread in her lap, practicing the same stitch I'd taught her that first Sunday until her lines came out straighter, more even something you could almost call a proper seam if you were feeling generous. She asked me once, needle paused mid-stitch, whether her mother knew how to sew, and I told her the truth that I didn't actually know that it wasn't the kind of thing everyone learned growing up. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered to her, and said she would teach her mother herself when things were better, because everybody should get to make something with their own hands at least once. I had to turn away from her for a moment, busy myself with a bolt of fabric on the shelf, because a 5-year-old had just articulated more wisdom about inheritance and repair than I'd managed to hold on to myself across 3.5 decades of giving without asking anything back. There was one visit months into the program when Maxine mentioned quietly that Marlene had finally said out loud in a session that she understood now what it had cost everyone, what it had nearly cost Winnie most of all. I don't know if that single admission changes everything that came before it. I don't think it needs to. I only know it mattered to hear that some part of her had finally stopped reaching for the nearest rope and started looking instead at what she actually wanted her hands to be doing. I saw her myself once, near the end of that first year at a birthday party for Winnie held in a park near Dwight's apartment. She kept her distance, mostly sitting a little apart from the rest of us at the picnic tables, but at one point she came over to where I was cutting the cake and asked stiffly whether she could help. We stood together a few minutes, slicing and plating in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't hostile either, something new and unnamed sitting between us instead. "Thank you for the fun," she said finally, not looking at me, her knife still moving through the cake. "I hated you for it for a long time. I don't anymore." I told her I understood, and that I hoped whatever came next for her, it would be built on steadier ground. She nodded, and we didn't say much else, but it was, I think, the closest either of us came to something like peace between two women who had never once managed to see each other clearly until circumstance forced the issue. Later that same afternoon, I watched her sit down on the grass beside Winnie's little embroidery hoop, the one I'd given her that first Sunday visit, and ask hesitant whether Winnie might show her how the stitch worked. I stood back near the picnic tables and watched my granddaughter guide her own mother's hand through a needle and thread with the patient seriousness of a much older teacher, correcting her grip twice, praising her when a line finally came out straight. Marlene's face, watching her daughter's small hands direct her own larger ones, held an expression I hadn't seen on her in all the years I'd known her. Something unguarded and a little stunned, like she was only just then understanding what it might have felt like to be given something instead of having to take it. I didn't say anything to either of them. Some moments don't need a witness announcing herself, only someone willing to let them happen undisturbed. I hosted Thanksgiving that year, the first holiday gathering under my own roof since everything had come apart, and I remember standing in my small kitchen the morning of counting place settings and realizing I needed more chairs than I'd needed in longer than I could recall. Faye drove down with a pie she'd insisted on making herself, despite my gentle suggestion that the bakery 2 streets over made a perfectly respectable one. Dwight arrived early to help me move furniture, Odessa beside him, quiet and watchful in the particular way of someone still deciding how much of herself to offer a family she was only just meeting. Hollis came up from his own apartment 2 floors below, carrying a bottle of wine, and an easy confidence that had settled into him more each month, kissing my cheek at the door like it was the most natural thing in the world by then, which by then I suppose it was. Winnie ran through the apartment twice before anyone had even sat down, checking every dish on the table, reporting back to me with great seriousness which ones looked the most promising. Marlene came for 2 hours in the middle of the afternoon, part of the supervised arrangement, still technically in place though everyone at that table had stopped thinking of it as supervision and started thinking of it quietly as simply Marlene's visit. She brought a dish of her own, a sweet potato casserole. She admitted a little sheepish. She'd needed to call her own mother twice to get right, and she sat across the table from me and passed the rolls when I asked for them, and didn't flinch when Winnie climbed into my lap instead of hers for the blessing. It wasn't warm between us, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but it was civil in a way that had cost both of us something real to arrive at, and I found myself grateful for it in a way I wouldn't have predicted a year earlier, sitting in that same kitchen with a tote bag on the floor and a text message that told me I wasn't real family at all. Looking around that table, crowded with people who had every reason to have scattered permanently in different directions, and hadn't I understood that family, real family, had never been about who showed up on a boat. It had only ever been about who kept showing up afterward at the harder, less glamorous gatherings when there was nothing left to perform for anyone. Hollis and I kept our Tuesday coffees through all of it steady, in a way that felt like its own quiet form of proof, and some Saturdays now he joined us on the balcony too, an easy presence, undemanding, entirely content to simply be there without needing the moment to be about him in any way. Dwight noticed him one afternoon, the two of them talking easily about nothing in particular, while Winnie chased something invisible across the sand below, and Dwight only smiled at me afterward quietly, the way a son smiles when he sees his mother finally getting something back that was owed to her a long, long time ago and never once collected on. I repainted the sign above the shop that spring, the same hand-lettered name, Ostrander's Alterations, but fresh gold paint over letters that had gone dull with weather and years. And I stood on the sidewalk afterward, the way I had stood on that same sidewalk the day Foster first told me the house was mine, and only mine. Except this time there was no grief tangled up underneath the pride, nothing waiting to be spent or defended. It was only a shop with my name on it, the way it had always been, and me standing in front of it 66 years old, still capable of choosing what to keep and what to finally let go of. Priscilla Dunmore came by that same week, married now nearly a year, carrying a photograph she wanted me to have of her walking down the aisle in the dress. I'd altered the waistline, sitting exactly the way it should have. She told me standing at my counter with a warmth I remembered from that first fitting that she'd thought about our conversation more than once, since the one about which pieces of yourself were worth defending, and that she'd ended up telling her mother-in-law gently but firmly that the guest list would include every single person Priscilla wanted there, or it wouldn't include the wedding planner Priscilla had hired either. I laughed real and unguarded and told her I was proud of her, and I meant it, the particular way you mean something when you've watched a young woman learn faster than you ever managed to. The lesson it took you 34 years in a sold house to finally understand for yourself. She left the photograph pinned to the corkboard behind my register where it stayed for the rest of the time. I kept that shop a small reminder that the things I'd learned the hard way were at least in some small measure passing forward into hands that might need them less painfully than I had. I drove out to the cemetery that same week, something I did perhaps twice a year, at most always alone. Always a little rushed, the way you visit a grief you're not sure you're allowed to still be carrying after so many decades. I brought the shoebox of letters with me that time, which I hadn't done before, and I sat on the grass beside Walter's headstone reading 2 or 3 of them aloud, quietly feeling foolish and unbothered by the foolishness both at once. I told him about the house, though I suspected somehow he already knew. I told him about Hollis more hesitantly, watching my own hands pull at the grass while I said it, and I told him I hoped it didn't feel like a betrayal, loving someone new this late and that. If it did, I needed him to understand I hadn't gone looking for it, only that it had found me anyway, the way good things sometimes do when you finally stopped bracing yourself against every door. I told him about Winnie's crooked red stitches, about the fund that would carry her to college regardless of what her parents' marriage had become, about a granddaughter who was growing up in spite of everything, surrounded by people who loved her without conditions attached. I sat there until the afternoon went long and gold, the same color the kitchen light had been on the morning. Everything started, and when I finally stood to leave, I didn't feel like I was walking away from him, so much as walking forward with him, folded quietly into whatever came next. The way he'd always been there, really underneath every decision I'd made since the day he died, whether I'd known it at the time or not. Hollis asked me not long after whether I'd ever consider giving up the lease on my apartment, and simply moving my whole life down one floor into his practical about it, in the way he was practical about most things, pointing out that we already spent more nights together than apart, and it seemed foolish at our age to keep paying for 2 kitchens neither of us used properly anymore. I laughed at how unromantic the proposal sounded and told him so, and he laughed too and said he'd save the romantic version for later if I wanted one, but that he'd learned burying one wife already, that the practical version was usually the truer measure of what a person actually meant. I told him I needed to think about it, not because I doubted my answer, but because I had spent 34 years making decisions for other people at a moment's notice, and had promised myself somewhere in the middle of that difficult year that I would never again let anyone rush me toward anything, not even something I wanted. I gave him my answer a week later over coffee, the same simple ordinary hour that had started the whole thing between us in the first place, and I told him yes, and watched him try not entirely successfully to keep his face as unromantic as his proposal had been. My 67th birthday fell that same spring, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately count, I didn't spend it quietly hoping someone would remember, without my having to remind them. Dwight and Odessa arrived with a cake from the good bakery 2 streets over the one I'd once suggested to Faye and been overruled on for Thanksgiving. Faye herself drove down again unannounced as always this time, with an overnight bag already prepared for a proper weekend rather than a rescue mission. Hollis had strung small lights along the balcony railing without telling me the kind you'd normally see at Christmas, and when I asked what on earth had possessed him, he only said a woman turning 67 deserved a little unnecessary sparkle, and that he intended to provide it whether or not I found it practical. Winnie presented me with a pillow she'd stitched almost entirely herself, lopsided and stuffed too full in one corner, a crooked letter V worked into the fabric in the same red floss from that first embroidery hoop. I have that pillow still propped in the corner of whatever chair I happen to be sitting in most days, and I don't think there has ever been a gift in the whole of my 67 years that I have loved as completely and as simply as I loved that one. I sat on my own balcony that evening, after everyone had finally gone home, full of cake and unnecessary sparkle, and more love than I think I'd fully let myself receive at one time, in longer than I could remember, and I understood something I hadn't quite let myself understand, even in all the months of untangling everything that had come apart. I had spent 34 years believing that love, real love, was something you proved through giving until it cost you something. What I finally understood sitting there with a crooked pillow in my lap and string lights swaying gently in the sea breeze was that love could also simply be received gladly, without needing to earn it first, through exhaustion, and that learning to receive it at 67 had been every bit as hard and every bit as necessary as learning at 66 to finally stop giving it away for free. On a Sunday not long after we all gathered on the beach below my building, Dwight and Winnie building an elaborate sandcastle at the waterline, while Hollis and I sat above them on the dry sand, coffee going lukewarm in my hands as the afternoon light softened around us. Winnie called us down eventually, insisting we come see immediately, and when we walked over, she pointed to each section of the castle with the seriousness only a child can manage over something that matters entirely to her, explaining carefully who lived where in her imagination, which tower belonged to which member of her family. And there she said, pointing to a small round tower near the back, a single shell pressed carefully into its side. "That one's for Mommy, for when she visits." I looked at that small, careful tower a long moment, sand already beginning to soften at its edges, the way sand always does, no matter how carefully it's packed, and I felt something in my chest settle into place that had been unsettled since the morning. A text message told me I wasn't real family at all, since a straw tote bag slid off my shoulder onto a living room floor and changed the entire shape of what I understood my own life to be. I thought standing there about the woman I had been the morning of the cruise, the one who stood in front of her mirror for 20 minutes, deciding whether she'd earned the right to try hard for something. I understood now in a way I couldn't have on that gold-lit morning that the trying had never been the question. I had always been trying every single day of those 34 years for everyone but myself. What I hadn't understood yet, standing in that bedroom in my floral dress, was that trying for yourself wasn't a betrayal of the people you loved. It was, if anything, the only way to make sure you had something left in you worth giving them at all. Because a 5-year-old girl had built a place in her sandcastle for every single person who loved her without asking any of them to prove it first, without weighing what any of us had given or taken or fought over in a courtroom across all those difficult months. Which meant that whatever the rest of us had broken along the way, however long it had taken to mend even part of it, something in her had come through the whole ordeal, essentially whole untouched at the very center of who she was. And I stood there in the late afternoon light with my son beside me and the ocean pulling gently at the shore, the way it always had and always would, long after all of us were gone from this particular stretch of sand. And I let that be enough exactly as it was without needing it to be anything more. Somewhere behind us up on the dry sand, Hollis was folding the picnic blanket the way he always did, corner to corner unhurried, and Faye's voice carried faintly from the balcony above, calling down something about supper. And Odessa laughed at whatever Dwight had just said beside her, and Winnie was already halfway to building a second tower before anyone else had finished admiring the first. None of it was the family I had once imagined boarding a boat with all those months ago, standing in front of my bedroom mirror, deciding whether I'd earned the right to try. It was better than that, I think, precisely because nobody at that table, that beach, that whole rebuilt life had earned their place in it by performing for anyone else's approval. They had simply stayed. And staying, I had finally learned at 66 years old, with sand still warm beneath my feet, and the whole slow gold evening still ahead of us, was the only inheritance that had ever actually mattered.